First, making prostration to the perfection of wisdom, and then this kind of commitment to teach in accordance with the needs of various beings. We should set our motivation of the various levels of motivation, the highest in accordance with the various lineage lamas, thinking, may I listen to this Dharma in order to be able to attain the state of full, perfect, complete enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings. And so there's the verse which says, to him who in his compassionate wisdom taught the sacred Dharma for the shunning of all views, to him, to Gautama, I bow down. And so this is a verse of praise, prostration to the Buddha, the Bhagavan, based upon recognizing his qualities, not just from a blind kind of faith, but based upon our own sort of investigative wisdom, recognizing the qualities in particular of the Buddha's speech, his enlightened activity of the speech, which is something that we should see with our own wisdom, and it is based upon our recognition of the qualities that he gained. It's not like a kind of creator God like Allah or God or Ishvara or something like that, but rather, as this first line says, to him who in his compassionate wisdom taught the sacred Dharma. So it is based upon the Buddha by seeing reality as it is, first having generated this attitude of the mind of awakening, and then training, accumulating virtuous qualities for 3 countless eons, finally became a completely and fully enlightened being, who then bent and turned the wheel of Dharma, taught to other sentient beings that which he had realized. And so it is mainly based upon the quality of the Buddha's speech, his teaching to us that we should be going, we should be making prostration or homage to him.
Buddha's teachings Sangye ane sunga tene shimju yabu chewa ina ane sangye sungkingi sangye rangi 아니 남대 생리 방부지 송요의 인상 아니 세부 최고시 말에 그레이트 사이언티스트 따와의 보기다 내가 타이 것이 송요의 참에 영코랑 그레이트 필로소퍼 아니면 또 조금 전부 자기의 다양한 상기기 저기 시인기 통해 손담부터 때리기나 한 상기 좀 된데 그냥 시인 친구들 때문에 기부시 자요에 봐. 근데 상기 좀 된데 공양행기 연대기 통해 때리나 한 그러면 공식을 전부 great meditator 되지 자요에 다양한 그런 게 로시인이야 럽적이야 롭스리베도 때문에는 약간 상이 좀 된데 롭스가 전부 great advisor 되지 자요에 상이 좀 된데 아니 지방기 최 양념식에 기대직 통해 제 때문에 상이 좀 된데 수립 공공만 토다 대대기다 개봉 간다 지금이 가면 되나 빅슈 개봉 친구지 개종 친구지 다 되고요. 대대기만 인자 남주 상이 좀 된다야 따다한테 상이 좀 된데 송초 용기 미술 시작을 하는데 상이 좀 된다으니까 같이 못 쳐줘야 돼. 하장 대적을 했어. 망부지 상이 좀 되는 수를 로미도 가는 배 아니 개별 보우체 아니 김이라도 좀 잡아채 아니 슈우체 야체 시행이 도스 때바로 참에서 대만도 Buddhist scientist 가서래 great scientist 이거 great philosopher 이거 great 아니 master 이거 great 아니 yogi 이거 아니 great advisor 이거 그래서 성실 보고 맞아 모두 치워져 맞아 상기에 못 줘야 돼 하장 계획이 있어.
So here, depending upon how we sort of look at the Buddha, we can look at the way in which he was very much a great investigator, right? He examined and used sort of valid reasoning, and when we look at the Buddha in that way, we can see him as being like a great scientist, right? And so too, in terms of his philosophizing, presenting various schools of tenets or various kinds of thought, we can examine the Buddha and see him as being like a great philosopher. And in terms of the kind of qualities of education or learning that he pursued and gained, we could also look at the Buddha and say he's sort of like a great educator. He's very learned in terms of his own kind of qualities. And so too, when we look at the Buddha's practice of meditation, his ability or sort of the practice that he undertook, we could see him as being a great meditator, a great yogi. And so too, if we examine the kind of advice and teachings that he gave to various students, from that perspective, we could see the Buddha as being like a great advisor. He is someone that gives excellent advice to those who seek after him. And so too, when we look at the kind of qualities of the Buddha's ethical conduct, having taken ordination, we could see him as being the kind of exemplar of someone who is leading that life of a bhikshu. And so by our way of kind of being introduced to the various qualities of the Buddhas, we see these various facets of what a great kind of being that he was, depending upon our really looking into that and being introduced to that. Sometimes we might think of just, the Buddha was born almost 2,600 years ago as the son of a king, and he renounced that and he went off and attained enlightenment. But that kind of simplifies the sort of qualities of the Buddha. By being introduced to these various facets, we come to appreciate those diverse qualities of the Buddha.
이제 다 대마사기 중간에 이제 텐제리인지 중간에 송샤에 다 송대 최송샤에 최대 시행람기 돈에 시행이다 아니 대세수만 들고요래 Buddhist science 남의 생리 되는 남의 도주 남의 공약에 숨만 들고요래
terms of kind of looking at the qualities of the Buddha, the Bhagavan, in terms of the Dharma that he taught, we could look at it in terms of the kind of sort of learning, the sort of education that the Buddha presented as well. We could see his kind of teachings in terms of being like a sort of science. We can look at the kind of view, the philosophy that he presented, as well as the level of taking that up into practice and meditating on it.
어디지? 다 때문에 남의 체리가 또좀 미 안에 퇴성 심중 제발라 인지면지 수소 남바이고 말해. 아니 남바이 마이 가리 있나야? 랑을 예배 생지와요. 부디스트 사이콜로지 도니 게시해이나 도와선제 담제리야 성동에 주바 성담되기 성무시와요. 성무되기 성무 생 시바스니 신이 되나 성시르바스 시작가리네 세프에 지다 시작가리네 리프에 네바지 맞을 생각이 다 리프에 네바지에서 포슈체로 따는데 아니 셰럽 생이지 로직 아니 수고요래 아니 인텔리전 위스톰 딘데이 셰럽 연예지 양 셰럽지 배주 당긴지 이나 딘데이 셰럽 배주 당긴지 대박 배주 당고와 채 셰럽 코람 배주 당배토네 부디스트 사이언스 부디스트 필로소피 아니 노멀 집단기 부디스트 메디테이션 그래서 로종체야, 퇴성체야, 심중체야 요래. 이것이 제가 삼가 남바이 말이에요.
So in terms of Buddhist science and Buddhist philosophy, these are things that we can investigate whether or not you consider yourself to be Buddhist. We all have a mind, we all have consciousness, and on that level we can benefit from these kind of Buddhist science and Buddhist philosophy, whether or not we consider ourselves Buddhist. So the definition of mind or consciousness is that which is clear and knowing. There's an object that appears to it or that it illuminates, and then there is the kind of awareness of that. And it is through the development, the increase of that awareness, that we develop our wisdom. And so whether you are someone who is considers yourself Buddhist or thinks of it in that way, you can use this to increase your wisdom. And if you're using just wisdom alone, you don't need to accept the sort of faith side. If connected with that faith, it is also possible to practice in that way. But there are teachings of the Buddha that are in general beneficial to us, whether or not we sort of accept the level of having faith in the Buddha as a religious teacher.
다 남의 체리다 남의 또주 디제제 마셔체 나무성기에 공양내세 네가 봐 공양내 대야 문에 전에 양타가지 세가되지 차상지 된다가지 계주 순행기 공양내지 지기이나 아니요 남의 체리야 대바지가 제일이죠. 이마이나야 남의 체가 체가 대배도안에 제월을 나야 돼야 실업 무도 소에 아니 대박 실업 싸우는 예배 대박 실업 때문에 대박 이제는 제네 공양매야 저도 이나 지난 남의 공양매 도당 뭐만디 되들 이 이만 신체네 말한 소리나야 실업 조금 제배 대박을 제네 공양매 주고 해지 자기고
So then on the level of practicing the meditative techniques of the Buddha's teachings, to do so in a sort of pure and complete way, we need to have the kind of connection with faith in the Buddha based upon recognizing his various qualities. But when we say that we should approach this with faith, that faith should actually be preceded with wisdom. Wisdom should be the root of the faith that one has, the kind of grounding of the faith that one has. And so faith alone, but a kind of faith that is grounded or comes from wisdom.
Tati mayudu sangi chumden di sum nalaya shirab ningzir dangjepe zube semje taduda sangi bindu nejepe zobe chasu semje dos neredwa. Shira shirab ningzir dangjepe yace ningje yabuji kiyate shirab dan drene kiyabudwa. Shirab dan manjepe ningje kiyate kabre ningje de ningje kolo doyata ningje busu sorje Nemayo. Shirabena, and Ninji Moa, Ninji Deva, Ninji De, and a Tamet Pet, the little Kizio is more. Jerome Jam, Sally Ninji Gomyam Naya, Lady, Yinaya, Gomyam Lamsama Che, Nielia, Tango Jajet, Monduza, Partu Shunu, Tabarisha, and Shine, Tamanin, Yamsula. Kuya tewa yewe chedo sebe, jiru chebi, namtar nyingu du dedwa. Dede yewa yundu, gom nyamne sebe, ke cheshe chile, rangi lunga yesu dulwa ta, nekabda tatu duwa ta, sangi yukowa top sebe, gom nyamne men kawe yo wale. Yinaya gom nyamne te, manolwa tewu putawu seda dewa, yabuju yuwa la, ane tesam yu, ane pe shiraki, 정동체도같이 고야 되겠죠. 근데 이제 토라기 남탕나라야 당분계제 되고 아니 대라 때문에 바로 주문 단계 다वर 샤송스 대대 인자 아니 예 타만 인생도 냠내체니 소로 타만 인생도 명소나 어디 람제페 자차 원경이 지나
in Buddha's teachings, this kind of faculty of wisdom is especially important. There is a praise to the Buddha, praising him for his qualities of love and compassion, but those qualities of love and compassion are grounded in a kind of wisdom. So that wisdom is indispensable to being able to take compassion to its fullest, being able to take that to its culmination. Without that kind of wisdom, one's development of love and compassion will likewise be limited. And so this is something where our kind of faith, as well as the practices of meditation, should be grounded in wisdom, as it is said from the autobiography of Gelama Tsongkhapa. He said that first he sought out extensive learning, and then the meaning of those texts arose as personal instructions, and finally he then practiced what he had understood day and night. And so it's in order to be able to attain these kinds of qualities, if we are trying to pursue meditation in a way that is really pure and authentic, it should be something that is grounded in first having that kind of learning. The success of our meditation is very much dependent upon the quality of our wisdom that precedes it, that grounds it.
Oh yeah. That today is that number sangi 공명인데 시를 조다 대배도네 냠리제 체. 다 되게 냠리제가 부터네 님고도 용도 아니 상계 좀대 랑이 숨 디바제 메자시 여러 무슨 소리체 랑이 쓰는 요소도 딘 상계 때문에 인세 공명네 님고도 되게 대해서.
So a practice of meditation should be coupled with our wisdom, and it's as well as the kind of sense of faith. And really, when we think about the essence of the practice of meditation within Buddhism, it's summarized in this verse: do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions, subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha.
Oh, not telaya, ya Three shikshas yore. Three shikshas sayade, lama sum sayade, lama tsujum lama tinsi lama shiru lama sum. Sangi yuchi nyamne sama do yonde, lama sum lama do yores. Ta lama tsujum lama tela, jomde degi, diwachaya mechashin, gyawa kusum sochi se desu. lava tingzi lava shiri lava tela rangi sem nyonso dur se tiso ta rangi sem nyomo mugiro duriyate lava tingzi lava da rangi sem nyomo sabyo de duriyate lava shiri lava diri ba yinza lava sum se lava nyamnes du.
So here, the kinds of trainings of the Buddha, the teachings of the Buddha can really be subsumed into these three trainings, as we would say in English. And this is the training of ethical conduct, the training of meditative stabilization, and the training in wisdom. And so all of the various teachings of the Buddha are subsumed into those three. And as in this verse, do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. That really elucidates the training in ethical conduct. And then where it says subdue your mind thoroughly, that comprises the teaching of meditative stabilization and wisdom. And so when it comes to our taming our mind in terms of our sort of manifest afflictive emotions, that is done through the practice of meditative stabilization. And in order to remove all of our afflictive emotions as well as their seeds, we engage in the training in wisdom.
달라고 숨세 인양네 telaya sakye chumde 숨 건규 용서부터네 아니 시대 때에 시바 이바이나 아니 telaya 탱맹이라고 숨 대징이라고 숨니 대징이라고 숨라야 도초로도 제 대징이라고 숨 사마도 대징이라고 숨세네 니 동용도 숨는다 탱맹이라고 숨 태고충 너희라고 숨 태고충 사마라고 숨.
So here, these three trainings, as they are contained within the entirety of the Buddha's speech, which we refer to as the Kangyur, we can speak about there being sort of three levels of that. Sometimes we refer to it as the Hinayana, or the lesser vehicle, but we can say the Pali tradition has the training in ethical conduct, meditative stabilization, and wisdom. And then there are the three trainings in terms of the Mahayana, and that is further divided into those that are Sutra, the three trainings of the Sutra, and the three trainings of Tantra. And so really we can speak about these three levels of the three trainings that are contained within the speech of the Buddha.
Oh yeah. 제가 디디디 상기의 최 냠의 파랑톤의 계지시나야 공냠의 짱짱톤의 계지시나야 시우지 야치고 띵상지 요래스.
So even if we speak just in terms of the practice of meditation, the teachings of the Buddha are very extensive, are extremely profound.
또 다른 게만저 상기의 최대 또 가르쳐요래 나나 로종의 최세 차요래스. 로종세 기 로테 남주의 삼로트스 요래스. 로. 다 남주의 삼로테라 로 신의 샤네 딘디 로테라 아니 트레이닝스라다 마인드 트레이닝 정답을 채워서 깨지고 저다 로종세 지선의 계시시나 만주의 위에 삼로테라 정답을 채워라 로종세 요레스 봐. 아 태권춘비 로종라나 태권춘비 로데 장주국세샤 딘디 태권춘비로 장주국세라 정답 채워라 대신으로 좀 세요레스 대부다 인디셔 로종 선까지 대신 로종 가르치고 로종 로카레 대신 로종 대신 로카레 어디 야고 뭐죠?
So as far as the Buddha Dharma that we are going to be explaining today, it is this of lojong, or mind training, is usually how it's translated into English. And so that first syllable, mind, is referring to our thoughts, our way of thinking. And the second syllable, jong, is referring to training that. So if we speak generally about mind training, we can say it's a way of working with or training our mind, our way of thinking. And particularly when we refer to Mahayana, or the great vehicle mind training, the first term Mahayana is referring to that attitude of bodhicitta, or the mind of awakening. So training our mind in that attitude of bodhicitta related to that is really the meaning of this Mahayana mind training. So it's important at the beginning to be introduced to what do these terms, what are the sort of dharma that we're talking about, what does that name of that actually mean?
Honest. That Lobsang Geshe Kordi Mashue Da Kenabari Chalaya Shu Lobsang Dume Shu Puyore Itatina Dene Pencil New Tatina Alemarazo Lobsang Geshe Lobsang Rangitone Yabushe Toche Gong Yami Chigi Singile Gong Yami Tata Cheshachi Yunde Kaleki Nimani De Lobsang Geshe Dela Shayun Tone Yabushe Toa Chita Nyamre Tone Nyamre Chitang Yabuchi Montuechi Shukyoris.
So I don't know that we have a page for those who are looking in English. This version is going to be slightly different than if you have the mind training by Jujinju, but it's not unfortunately going to follow exactly that, although all the lines will be in there. But so if you do have some paper in front of you to be able to follow along, get that ready as well as your pencil, because over these 2 days, as we are going to be learning about this mind training in order to be able to be successful in practicing it, right? So there are these 2 levels of learning what this is about and then actually taking that up into practice. So please look at your text. So the name of this text, this particular version, is the 7-point mind training together with the outline or the sort of subject, so those 7 points. So first I will explain the meaning of mind training and 7 points.
Lobsang says the Kung to Sati Sangye Rangi Fik Karichabi Divaja Misash Yoga Soba Chit Setima Rangi Semme Yonsudus Sangye Rangi Semme Yonsudula. That is two Geshe Sem Dulala. So that Sem Dul Shebe Sem Teda Lo Dul Lo John Shebe Lo Michikash. The day you are Sem Dul Seda Lo John Lai Nidi Chuchianes.
So as far as the kind of source, the origin of this term mind training, we talked about that verse earlier where it said do not commit any non-virtuous actions. That's not the point that we're talking about, but that third line where it says subdue your mind thoroughly. This is really, the terms are slightly different in the Tibetan, but the mind here is the same as the lo, and subduing your mind, working with or taming your mind is really the meaning of this mind training.
Tamamzo Pegi Nala Loche, Anirjipache, Shebache, Samoche, Yusama, Jibushi.
So in the Tibetan, there are some terms that are synonymous. So mind, awareness, consciousness, and our sort of thinking, these are synonymous, we could say.
Teacher, I will say it. I do not Marazu Susu Yube, Samuta, Lojong, Lote, Marazu Susu Yube, Samuta,
So we should understand this term mind in terms of our own individual thinking, right? Our own individual thoughts and ways of thinking, our mind.
No. That in John said, Tela, Ane Karisugores Lavina, John said, Tela, Pebesi Nala, and John Lay, Cabre, Ane Yaki Tamiala, Kuchichi, Cabre, Menoswela, Koyachi, Nino, Pechashamina, Giyingi Gidula, Kura, Lobsang Shayun John Lala. 코로나기 에듀케이션 시행에 마시바 시바체 시바데 약게 공부도 당해야 되나 아니 연대 정도라고 저가 연대 정 시행 정대 연대 마토 토버지 토버 공부도 해야 되나 정서 공부도 그랬지 리게 시행이나 자바게야 식사 세기 10세들 저가 리 정 시행 되는데 고야 책에 가래 가라 마토 토버지 토버 공부도 약게 당해야지 딜라드 단단로 정 시대 정디 야가로 삼다나 가래래 가라 스스 성을 나로 라스 성로 야가 되게 돼 마게 깨버치 성로 야가 깨버데 공부도 약게 당해야 되라 로종 라비었다 이 야부터 시행들이
So here, this term in Tibetan Zhong, that we usually translate as training, can have two sort of understandings that go with it. So the first is in terms of improving or developing something that is good, and then we can have the sense of eliminating or removing something that is unwanted. And so here, in terms of the first kind of understanding, we could say the way that a teacher teaches a student in order for them to be able to come to an understanding, to improve on or develop qualities which they did not have before. This is a kind of training. So in order to be able to gain those kinds of qualities, one engages in training or learning, developing that kind of education and understanding. So here, in terms of our own mind, trying to develop, improve those kinds of good qualities within our positive qualities within one's own mind is one connotation of the word training.
다양 종세의 책책이 매버서봐, 쌍마서봐, 대대로 빼나 디파 종라나 디파 매버서야. 녀몽 종라나 녀몽 매버서. 마타파 종라나 마타파 타버치가. 어디대지가 종 디파 종, 녀몽 종, 마타파 종 슬라드 매버서와 타버치가.
And on the other hand, this other sort of meaning of zhong for training is to eliminate something, or to cleanse something. So in terms of purifying or eliminating a negativity, eliminating an afflictive emotion, to make that which is impure to be pure. So to cleanse or to purify, to eliminate, is also a meaning of to train.
저기 배나 되고 정말도 되고 매우 소와 디나 신체 수수기 성류 나로라 야도 도 이체 제와도 미개와 아니 상보다 녀마 미체 성류 나라 두거 성류 나라 두거 수수사바 성류 강시 코로에 마이나 라라에 되게 셰라에 되게 최고에 되게 풀어야 되게 된지기 장신이라 내가 동네 강에 제벌치 된지 성부대 성부도래 된지기 성부도가 네게티브 톡 된수 제대 정세대 안 되었어요. 제가 내나라 성부도가 나라 라포 차와 엄부지가 가다 녀몽 상마 매버스요. 라미팅시 매버스야. 어떤 된지기 소화했어.
So, for example, when we talk about to train in the sense of eliminating those things which are negative, like when we say to purify a negativity, to eliminate that kind of negativity, we have within our own mind that which is positive and negative, good and bad. So whatever it might be in terms of our own thoughts, our own ways of thinking that are negative, that are harmful to ourselves and others, both in the short term and in the long term, to get rid of those kinds of negative thoughts, to eliminate our various afflictive emotions, our self-cherishing. This is also a meaning of to train.
자 친구지 개 친구지 내가 친구지 지구에 소고기 가려나 나랑도 남아산 예배 저기 아니게 도착다 남배도 깨자 마셔봤지 그냥 직당이 zamling 나와라 최케 내나이라 최케 만내나이라 직당이 zamling 나와라 아니 민남기 삼로동당 야고다 도가니 게체 미스나리아 데워도네 니즈모 배우가 삼로동당 가져야 정말이나야 미디 미제 조당 야고처럼 삼로동당 가져 도가 노출이 치면이나 미디 미제티라 누구요 데레가 인자 최케 내냐고 매내냐를 수수 미스지는 비고요 rangi misi piwe kate misi di ane yakuchi, sambuchi ane tanda tanda-chi misi pigi ibe misi di ane chi nyeba ane chi tanda mideba notu ane chi rangshena noya dede-chi misi pigi ibe di susu ki lakao tuwa dede ima inza susu mene misi chi pigo gangshi la 미지대야 삼로당기 당기 미지피고야래 삼로당기 당기 미지피에 까봐 삼로 부자 땅에 미지피는 가르쳐요 삼로 양땅 미지피는 가르쳐요 이 이와지 체 아니 신에 삼로 부자 땅에 미지피에 책임이 삼로 양고 땅에 미지피와 책임이라는 것을 좋아이나 미지피에 장도가 이게 로종세기 로종 신유 유대대 남주 미시 야고비에 와야 계획되지 않고 최계는 개판이다.
So these teachings, this dharma of mind training is extremely important. It's really an essential kind of thing. This mind training, whether we are someone whether we're talking about sort of Buddhist philosophy or not, whether it is someone who accepts religion or someone who does not, when we think about our life and how we live our life, we can see that our way of thinking, the way that our mind goes, determines the kind of negative or positive that we experience. So however many negative kinds of thoughts that we might have, we are going to experience bad results from those. And however much we are able to develop positive, kind of good thoughts within our mind, that will lead to good results. And so when we think about how we go about living our life, conducting our life, it's really in our own hands. It is through the power of our thoughts that we experience good or bad. If we are driven by negative thoughts, we are going to experience bad results. Whereas on the other hand, however much we are able to develop kind of good and positive thoughts, we will experience good as a result. And so the kind of learning of mind training is really, regardless of whether we accept religion or not, is something that is beneficial because it brings about good in the way that we live our lives.
Oh yeah. That 단기 딜에 인사마지 계제셔야겠나 남바산 예배 태과충무 농가 가리네 남배 지용이 떠주기 가래라나 지대거가 위험하대서 God creator 아니 Allah ईश्वर तेजो 지대거가 말해 지대거가 위험하대라 아 지대거가 매나 아 랑기 메시지니 때문에 파워도야 세대의 처만이가 해야 되나 세대지니가 아니 제가 내수도 선다 나 세대지니 얘기가야 줘야 까봐 아니 대화동에 망부지면 뭐 아니 내가 시작 아니 상당 예스 대화 중요해 나 때문에 대화동에 대해 시작 중요 대대가 이제 시작 되게 간제스 중요해 시작 되게 나라 상당 얘기 영어 간제스 채워 시작 되다게 뒷 대화에 뒷 대회 뒷 동네 교회 뒷 대화에 뒷 동네 간제스 채워 라드사가 나와상에 또 나와 제방ပေါ်센점이 있는데 소리 제가 캐랑라 이 선물이 이 년반에 칼을 세야 참아 키라랑기 따당기 삼르기 따당다 저요래라 디 대화를 디 동해에 세야디야 추노네 대화 동해로 아무런 주가지 랑게토라지요 말레스 키라랑기 셈라 때네 아니 데도 샤레스 데게이마 인자 대화가 동해 지대기 뇌기 지대기 거봐 주기 생제 수수기 강대세 강과 사야 동야 수수랑이 간제스 종래 디 제법 소리 디 거봐 소리에서는 God created the maris 결혼기 대화 동행이 제법 결혼했어 오늘 결혼기 대화 동행이 제법 결혼이는 결혼기 수프들을 세미를 해서는 조세들을 했어 데레이다 남대 도주기 제법을 생점이 문제스 다 대만도 남도 시행에 내가 취시지
So if we go slightly deeper into thinking about this, into the Buddhist way of thinking, according to Buddhism, there is no creator God. There's no one that created this world like Allah or God or Ishvara or some kind of being like that. And so if we think about sort of happiness and suffering, it's not as though those are created by such a being or given to us somehow. And if we accept that there is both this life and future lives, past and future lives, particularly we become concerned with our happiness and suffering in both this life and in future lives. So when we think about the objects that we label as being happiness or being suffering, how is it that we distinguish between those two? What is good or what is bad? What is happiness and what is suffering? Well, anything that we posit as happiness or suffering is really dependent upon our own mind, right? We have an object that we take, and in relation to our way of thinking, we posit that as being happiness or we posit that as being suffering. So one of the sort of unique tenets of Buddhism is that this whole world is created through mind, is dependent upon our mind, whether we are talking about the external environment, our own body, our possessions, the beings that inhabit that environment. They are all created through mind. It comes about through mind, not by being created by some sort of external creator God. And so the conclusion to that is that you are the creator of your own happiness and suffering. It is based upon your way of thinking and what happens in your mind that creates happiness and suffering. And so this is a very essential point.
Today, 계란을 뜨게 아니 상년 대화동에 제법이 결혼을 왔어. 제법 결혼기 나네 결혼기 수고도 생기 나네 조생으로 왔어. 생기 로레스. 이게 말이야 결혼기 생선에 결혼기 로테 종달이 아버지 맞지나 결혼기 미제나 대도 잡으려고 그러셨다. 그래서 이게 말이야 가족이 로라 종달이 좋아이나 결혼기 대화동에 상마 결혼기 앞에 돈에 두고 그러나 이게 말이야 지딩이 제법고 쌤 임백이 따로 유니 시름을 깨지시는 로종 와야 돼 제법고 로게 종달 당해 주세요. 내가 쉬우자다 돼. 이때 내가 지금 그거 깨내나 로종서 종 말해. 지금 그거 깨서 결혼하면 나와 내가 두개 갈 수 있는 소리를 나한테 말해요. 결혼도 좀 가르쳐. 그러와. 근데 지딩이 제법으로 이나 신의 로드 종달 채나 로 테라 때문에 로 예발라 때문에 저것도 그 까야 로 상고나 때문에 저들이 요한이 그 두비야 딘데기 미스도 걸어와 그래서 이 잡아 남바 지딩 거고 지딩이 제법고 셈이 말 계획이 시험에 로종이 최대 딱 계속 잡았어.
So here, if it is independence upon you, that there we posit good and bad, happiness and suffering, and not just independence upon you, the creator of your own happiness and suffering is is you, but out of your body and your mind. It's the mind that creates happiness and suffering. And so if it is the case that this is in your own hands, then it is up to you to, again, as we connect this with mind training, training the mind becomes extremely important. There is no external kind of creator of the world, but rather you are the creator of the happiness and suffering that you experience. And so you need to train that creator mind, right? That is the source of your happiness and suffering, is your own mind. And so if it is the case that you are to accept some kind of external creator being, then you wouldn't need to do mind training, right? You sort of make requests to that being asking for happiness, but you don't have any responsibility to work with your own mind. However, as Buddhists assert that your own mind is really the creator of the world, is that which creates your happiness and suffering, then it becomes up to you to stop those kinds of negative minds that create suffering and to try to foster and develop those kinds of positive minds, those good minds that lead to happiness. This is an extremely important point. If we are the creator of our own happiness and suffering, then it is incumbent upon us to really work on training that mind.
어디서 백 내가다 돌아나 아들이 직디 시킨다 로종디 개척이면 직디 시킨다 맨날 나도 진행이 나와야 아니 미들어 대신 손도와 미 코라로 손도와 이 대신 손으로 미카카로 나온다 수술하는 미세다 당고 시베트스 부각지 수술하기 부모가 제일 나한테 강상 쉬고 로쪽손 내야 내 아이 대화이는 아니 진에 지내시려고 막 강상 배우기는 로쪽손에 이제 쉬고 와도 되게 제야야야 제 개고 마차를 거루기 미치기 나한테 강상 쉬고 때 로쪽주래나 얘가 개고를 미치기 수수 미치라 미세나다 숨이고도 와안 수수 갈라그래 남마마 지배돼 남마마 슈루다 다르네 담아 개뭐 차서 개를 비싸 손도와 상계적인 얘기가 캐랑이 로종 영향이고 제발이다 캐랑이 로종 영향 제발라 때네 캐랑라미가 기부속이 민라고 해요 기부충 기부든 기부충부사야 제가 상계 정된 얘기 최소가 상황과 기후속이 최소가 되고요. 대라야 저 가서 저쪽 반대 어디샤게 아니 기후속이 라운드세 창조 라운드 속지. 제가 창조 라운드 나라 기후속 생이 제가 기후속이 양소와의 최 기후속이 최 기후속이 양소와의 라 기후속이 라운드세 송도와 제가 내일은 기부숨 세지도와 제가 내일은 나라적으로 좀 생인데 냠nen치기 지금은 계시잖아 로종이 냠nen데 쇼쇼 제마도 같이 지당게 미스디 지고지게 그롱지다 제 막 미스디 대화조는 제사를 동네 마조는 제사를 세게 상로들이 지당데 미스 대치고 줄라 펜베 로종 양변시에 지금 대대기 밑에라야 기부충 난 밑에게 로종 양변에 뭐지 미유지 쳐다 난 미스 대치고 상담을 내다스 미스 대기 냠도 미스 대가 제가 치매 대도이 제가 치매 대도이 개침물에 대단자네 로종 양변 제기라니 지lep소나 대가야 기부충 개발제를 당연히 기부충 써보고 다들 기부충이 나는 야 써보때 내세토 기부충 개발제를 대가 난 대가가 다도 로종이 냐면 세토를 따네 기부충이 나래가 자네 니종들이 공토에 로종 냐면 최소나 아니 미리 약게 체제 세토를 체제 콜라 기부충 세미라고 다들이야 장주로 세부로 종야게 된대로 종야게 체통에 제 차소나 아니 된대게 되라 기부치고 올라가 그래서 Dede yoga yinza lojong ki nyamre khorang ke thone soso ki meze nala soso kiwu chumu zabo la degi yimbe di yake tane kiwu chumu kebachi chani yimbe di yake tane kiwu ding chani yimbe di yake tane kiwu chumu chani yimbe samta but this samta ne nga pe kiwu chumu ra chigi lana lojong ki nyamre degi de samma 아니 기우스게 람다 기우스게 로종다라 두네 냠린 쳐 아니 디체는 얘기를 그래서 디체가 있다 로종 냠린이 토네 소소라니 기우충 딩충 숨어야 교를 외웠다 이야기를 외웠다
So here, this is an extremely important point that we need to train our own minds, take a sort of ownership of our own mind. And here, relatedly, when we think about, we often in the context of Buddhism talk about the three types of being, but we could think about that in terms of our own life, right? There was a time when we were a child, and then sort of depending on what culture you're in, you pass into a stage of adulthood. In Tibet, they used to look at that as like 13 years old, but from that point until maybe you get to like 65, you're an adult, and then you get into being an elderly person. So we can look at in terms of our own life, we kind of have a development, of course, from a time we were a child, a time that we're an adult, and then a time when we become elderly. And so too, when we speak about the three types of beings in the context of the stages of the path, the being of small scope and middle scope and great scope, and these kind of terms trace back to Jo Atisha's Lamp for the Path, this stages of the path literature, which talks about the three types of beings based upon the scope of their motivation. And so this is the kind of, these types of beings are sort of like the stages of our life, right? We progress from one to the other based upon practicing them well. So if you're a practitioner who is only striving for happiness in just this life, only thinking about the sort of getting happiness and alleviating suffering of just this life, we would be called merely a small scope practitioner. And if you go slightly beyond that, not just thinking about this life alone, but rather thinking about your happiness and suffering in future lifetimes, that would be a sort of special kind of attitude of a being of the small scope, in which you are contemplating what will come in the future and thinking about training your mind in order to ensure your future happiness and suffering, the future life. And getting to a higher level still, when you have a sense of renunciation, of wanting to get out of samsara entirely and pursuing the kind of practices that lead to that, that's the sort of attitude of a being of the middling scope. And when you go beyond even that to thinking about not just your own aims, but the welfare and benefit of all sentient beings, then you achieve the kind of attitude of a being of great scope. And so in your own life, in the way that you proceed through various types of being, right? You go from being a child to being an adult to being someone who is elderly. So too, we should examine, well, what point am I at in terms of this kind of spiritual development? And really, we can't just say, oh, I'm going to be a being of the Mahayana, I'm going to be a being of great scope, without having the kind of foundation or practices of the being of small and middling scope. So it is in dependence upon developing those sorts of attitudes and intentions, the practices of those various types of beings, that we are able to arrive at the kind of practices of a being of great scope.
로종기 냠네 아니베 제가 역도스네가 아니 로종기 냠네 제당 게베 소소라니 기부 중년 최소 간 차야 여러디 시행에 계시고래 나 되네 따오나 로종기 나라 다들 되나라 로종 된데마서 손도 왔어 네 가게에서 나와이나 로종 된데마세에 손에데 택과처럼 로종 로종도 땅에 된데데 손아요 대가 로종 된데마세에 소 택과처럼 로종 된데마가 포버레스 네 택과처럼로 와야지 장주 우셈이래스. 대대기 장주 우셈 아니 정답을 제외 깝라 아니 장주 우셈 양의 제단과 개에 되는 순간 인사 로종 된든가 그래. 로종 된든 마와의 다다를 들어와 로종 된든 땡이 빼자들라 로종 된든 마
So there for the kind of quality of our mind training or understanding how we are practicing this, evaluating this for ourselves is something that is very important for us to be able to do. And turning back to the name of this text, usually in English we put it as a 7-point mind training. And this is really in the context of training the mind in the Mahayana, or the great vehicle. So we need to understand that these 7 points are in relation to a kind of development of this attitude of bodhicitta, the mind of awakening. So these are mind training teachings connected in particular with the training training our mind in this attitude of the mind of awakening, or bodhicitta, that comes in 7 points, is how we put it in English.
딱 로종 된든마디 된든디 배제가 망망 된 요구래. 나 이나야 예 남편 쉬어 가와 쉬어가 이나야 너된 게시 된두 숨부터 쉬어래. 얘는 책줄 남편은 간절 숨부터 쉬어래. 뒤에도 다른 이나야 아니 로종 된든마디 아니 너된 게시 된두 생절 된들 간절 숨부터 쉬어야지. 라 dorten Geshe Tendu.
So here these 7 points will come in order as we go through the text, but in general when I give teachings on a text, we usually do a kind of a summary of the text, a more extensive explanation, and then a concluding kind of summary of that.
다 담보되라 아니 니네 생들 행들 간들수.
And connected with that as well, we have the kind of commentary on the meaning, the commentary on the words, and a commentary on the speech itself.
간들수 아야. 다 이제 다 담보 dorten 다 dorten들라 로종 된된세 된된이 나라 대담보 태고치고 로종 용원로 원로 당부도 먼저치 아 이바데 의식 장주 불선이라고 그러죠. 이바데 의식 장주 불선이라고 그러죠. 다때 수바데 개념 랑켈 세체 개념 랑도켜 개념 랑켈 시와텔라 세지기념에 듣는 때마세 세지기념에 듣는 때마세 다때네 응아바 telaya 아니 로종에 세때마세 얘네 주바텔라 아니 로종게 아니 당색체 당색 로종게 당색세가 로종게 당색체 얘네 마바텔라 로종게 납차 가서 등바텔라 로종게 납차 제대 늘
Here, in terms of the 7 points of this mind training, the first is the presentation of the preliminaries, the basis for Mahayana mind training. And then the second point is the main practice of training in the awakening mind. The third point is taking adverse conditions onto the path of enlightenment. The fourth point is a presentation of a lifetime's practice in summary. Fifth is the measure of having trained the mind. The sixth is the presentation of the commitments of mind training. And seventh is the presentation of the precepts of mind training.
로종게 다 최게 뭘로 세죠 사제 당부들 다 대세되는 당부 태고치고 로종게 뭐 대대기 니바 무시 창조 셈니라 로 정마디 야구지 용알라 가지도 지 뭐라 냥년 쳐거죠. 어디라 로좀 용어로 대대기 로좀 용어로 되라 아니 테스마 게바도 제외나 만 계획신이 때 마세 주시 대중이 조합하다 레드를 코리님이 나 로좀 용어로 되라 너 사체당 대제 당목 로좀 용어로라 나
So here, in terms of again the preliminaries, we then have the preliminaries to the second point of training in the awakening mind, which is the main practice, which is further divided into conventional mind of awakening and the ultimate mind of awakening. And in order to be successful in training the mind in those, you need to have these kinds of preliminaries that which precedes this kind of training in the mind of awakening. And so those are generally, the preliminaries to that are generally divided into 5. The first being relying upon a virtuous spiritual friend or a spiritual teacher, recognition of the preciousness of this human birth and the difficulty of finding it, contemplating death and impermanence, contemplating karma, cause and effect, as well as a reflection upon the defects of samsara.
다 되네 니바 전세 비유가 니바 무시 대고준으로 가서 무시 장주를 셈니로 보죠. 장주를 셈니해야 돼. 아니 제주를 보내 이야기 군수 장주를 셈다 대답 장주를 셈으로 보죠. 되리. 다 군수 장주를 셈으로 좋아라야 뭐 이렇게 또 다시냠주를 보죠. 있으면요래. 대답 장주를 셈으로 좋아해. 做东北的是东印工党，确当在大麦东北工党所有的是，但你跟着你的钱。
So then, when it comes to the second point, training in the awakening mind, which is the main practice, we could divide these into 2 in terms of 2 of cause and effect. But here we're referring to, in particular, 2 in terms of the conventional awakening mind, which we can develop through various methods of training. But here, primarily, is taught through the practice of equalizing and exchanging self and other, and the training in the ultimate awakening mind is really referring to the wisdom realizing emptiness, the wisdom that realizes the selflessness of persons and phenomena, and the training in that wisdom side.
다 되네. 근데 수바디 개인의 람켓 세들이. 다 개인의 람켓 세들라. 아니 지당체나 개인의 람켓 세들라. 뭐요? 또 레게 사베톤에 개인의 람켓 세와. 군수 장주 우선 고베톤에 아니 개인의 람켓. 전담 장주 우선 고베톤에 개인의 람켓. 개인의 아니 디남 신기 아니 사마 제베톤에 개인의 어디에 돈에 개인의 제당량 막고요레스.
So then the third topic is taking adverse conditions onto the path of enlightenment. And there are various different methods of training in this or approaches to taking adverse conditions onto the path of enlightenment. There is that contemplating karma, thinking about karma, a cause and effect. There is as well the training in the conventional awakening mind as a means of taking adverse conditions onto the path. There is that of training in the ultimate awakening mind in order to deal with the various adverse conditions we face, as well as that related to the secret mantrayana connected with that and the various methods presented therein.
이나야 로좀 든든한 코랑이 짜증나라 짜증날 때 개념을 때가 니요 삼백번 개념을 조회번 개념을.
So here then in terms of this third point and the root verse verses that are connected here. There is then two various points, which is sort of taking adverse conditions on the path in a sort of secret way and through the training of the conventional awakening mind.
세치기 냠내 전쟁 시발이다. 전쟁 시발 세치기 냠내 들네 때마다 있어와. 네 가르쳐 보려면 세치기 냠내 소리 미스치기 냠내. 라라스스기 미스치기로와 미스치기 나라 냠내치야. 들네세 독도스 닝보 미스치기 냠내치 빼먹고요와. 이네 되게 참고 독도라고. 아니 들네 소바텔라 아니 딱 도드는 소바텔라 체질이냐면 제일 때마 뒤담다 니요 무시 공개 아니 수배가 아니 냠네 지네 냠네 제다지 시간만 보대라 아니 체질이 냠네 지네 딱 냠네 똑똑스 냠네 제다지 니요를
So then, as for the fourth point, which is a presentation of a lifetime's practice in summary, so this is really summarizing or sort of essentializing the various points of practice across the course of a lifetime. And this could be understood in terms of 2 points. There is the kind of practice that one engages in prior to the time of death, over the course of one's life, the way in which one practices. And then there are the kinds of practices at the time of death. So this summarizes the sort of presentation of a lifetime's practice in terms of those 2 points.
that didn't the low jump and test. That did John said the old by the general John Massey John. Nambu low John said some other by the John John, that they old by the John. The low John by said the low John Yang Chene, Dengsu to be Joroba, Dengsu, Diana Nave, low John Yang Chene, Dengsu to Sosio, or did say, Sata say, Zama, did say. Kerang low John Yang Chene, 타만데라 키라라 로존 양내 제네 중대스네 로존 양내 제네 키라라 댕수 뽑아 아니 딱바 로존 양내 딱바 제도네 차서 게 가르쳐놔야 니 로존 양내 제도도 유세 댕댕이 아니 중대야 내가 댕수 되게 세줘봐 오데라 로존배 세 사타 세
So then the fifth point is the presentation of the measure of having trained the mind. And so here in the English we sort of put it in the past tense. The spelling is different in Tibetan because it is once you have engaged in these trainings and come to the point where you have a kind of confidence in it, you have some certitude in your ability to practice. So once you have gained a measure of that kind of sort of success or results from your practice, you have this sense of, oh, I can do this no matter what sort of conditions that I encounter. I am able to uphold these kinds of trainings. That then is in this fifth point of the presentation of having the measure of having trained the mind.
다 때문에 전생 주파 로종기 당색 시작하되 로종 냠내 지혜지 수수문에 탑출지나 대보적으로 로종양의 지기 탑책이나 대대기 대보적으로 로종양의 지기지 아니 로종양의 지기기 가사되기 당자의 책 대대지가 내보내 세 당자의 책 계례제의 책 계례 제만하신 전다 대대지래야 라벤다 그래 세야 되라 로종기 당색.
And so then the sixth is the presentation of the commitments of mind training. If you have made this decision that you are going to engage in these trainings, you've concluded, you've decided that you are going to do this, this is the sort of like commitments in which you will abide, the sort of things that you have accepted or have determined to uphold as a kind of commitment to engaging in mind training.
Oh yeah. 다들 전세 들어가 로종의 람차. 다들 로종의 람차 시에 람차때 갑이 람차, 두비 람차. 결혼 로종 양님 지기 이다. 디디 제총 말에 디 지기로 말에서 까야 람차지. 다야 결혼 로종 양님 지기는 디 니모도 지어버리에서 두비야 람차지. 제네 람도로 람차되나 로종 람차스.
And then finally, the seventh point here is these presentations of the presentation of the precepts of mind training, which can be subsumed into two things that you are going to shun or abandon, avoid, and those things that you are positively committing to doing. So, in terms of, again, if you have decided to make this kind of commitment to mind training, there are certain precepts in terms of those actions that are to be abandoned and those that are to be positively adopted and engaged in.
Oh yeah, that the GK lozum to do make dorten house. That gave us a better
So that from up till now has been a summary of the text of the 7-point mind training, and now we will turn to going through a more extensive explanation, beginning with the start of the text.
Oh, lozum to do my shebala 다 소부대 통화를 개발해 바로 개발 쇼도 담을 개발 주도 숨체 다 되나네 담보 숨래 담보 통화를 개발 레게 돼 최초가 잡아 담자와 아 통화를 개발해 돼 라야디 로종이 빼져되기 아니 통화를 쓰는 뭐라 담보라 아니 약고 유행의 체도 제대로 다 약고 유행해라 최초 처음 줘야다 잡을 담자가 되어와 이인데 나한테 싸워도 돼 투지 처벌나 자세로 매만 비즈니 원네 세링만을 기와이 도쟁이만 주시시 중대로서 시험차 님만고 도와대 장주로 기와이 대파도 빈시다 기와 인자 책체.
So here, then turning to the text itself, this explanation of the 7-point mind training has 3 points. At the beginning, in order to bring about a virtue, one could say there is the homage and the pledge to compose the text. And then there is the virtue in the middle, which is the explanation of the actual text, coming in 7 points. And then there is the virtue at the end, which is the conclusion. And here, I don't believe that this is in the version of English, at least that I have, but it begins, in order to successfully complete a text, when one begins that, you do so first by paying homage and also making a kind of pledge to compose. And so this begins with, I bow to the greatly compassionate one. And as for the sort of essence of this nectar of instructions, it is from the lineage of Serlingpa. And so here, like a Vajra, the sun, and a tree, a medicinal tree, I will explain the meaning of this text. And so here, in this time of these 5 degenerations, we will transform this into the path of enlightenment.
Oh yeah. 다 되게 담보 투지 정보가 차세보라 다 투지 정보 세야 돼 투지 정보 세야 되나 정도의 투지 정보 예능의 투지 정보 니요 예능의 투지 정보 세야 돼 상계 탐지기 투규 상계 탐지기 규를 예배 닝지 정보 되나 예능의 투지 정보 세요레스 된대기 인지 정보 때 파이 나마와 샤르데와 파마 제레스 정보전도 차시와라 소와 제레스 야락수 디게드 상마 정도의 도시 정보스 이게 니들의 도시 정보다 정도의 도시 정보 니라 아니 겹수 줘야 거는 자세 실더래.
So here, this first homage, I prostrate to great compassion, or the greatly compassionate one. We can understand this in both a kind of provisional way, one that requires interpretation or is provisional, and in a definitive way, As for the definitive great compassion, that refers to the great compassion that exists within the continuum of all Buddhas. And then the sort of provisional or level of that is those beings that appear. For example, Avalokiteshvara, four-armed or thousand-armed Avalokiteshvara, the embodiment of that great compassion. Whereas the definitive great compassion is that within the continuum of all Buddhas.
다 차세세기 유라 아니 막고 쉬우지 요래 얘네 다른데 투지 정보를 차세기 경제가 해서나 다가 말하면서 태고 정력이 로종시에가 그래 태고 정력로 대 장주부 쌤들래 장주부 쌤께 깨다 마게 장주부 쌤 깨야 유 소디 가래서나 닝지 정보 투지 정보 닝지 정보 매나 장주부 쌤 싸움이 이렇게 돼요 대대가 인자 태고 정력로 장주부 쌤이 싸워대 닝지 정보로 도기와 인들 대정으로 좀막 싸우는데 통막 닝지 정보를 찾아야 이 소리 내가
So here there are many objects to whom they could pay homage at the beginning of this text. So why is it that he pays homage to great compassion, or the greatly compassionate one? Well, this is a text of Mahayana, or the great vehicle mind training, and that is based upon the development of the mind of awakening, this attitude of bodhicitta. And in order to be able to generate bodhicitta, one necessarily needs to have great compassion. It is on the basis of great compassion that Buddhas develop the mind of awakening and eventually become Buddha. So here it is an important point that because this is a text on Mahayana mind training, that initially they pay homage to great compassion.
Oh yeah. 다들 이 쇼데라 매만 두진인 분이 손도와 이 매만이 태고처럼 좀 되는 매나 대대의 매만 되라 아니 두진인 분의 명다 아 두지 말아서 두지 라이라데 아니 두지들라 제 계주 숨숨되어와 치와매와 라소와 딱 간다 제 두지 라이는 상가 아니 치와 매버 소토야 네 매버 소토야 아니 저게 랑기 또 고뇌고 빼도와 대대기 계주 강제 균이 차례만 보지 매버 소토야 지다 연대기 차례만 보지 깨도야지 대대지 터네 되지 나 되지라야 뭐예요 되지 인보 소 저기 태고 처벌로 좀 예체 매마디 두지 님보 남신 레스 제네 매마 두지 님보 스민다 대대게 매마 두지 님보 디 아니 간에 중발에 쿵 매마 기바 매마 지르기 균 매마 레가서나 마리스 대대게 매마 두지 님보 디 기시 체가와게 야콘 도사데 조조 반대 아디샤도 조조 반대 아디샤 아니 인도네시아에서 세딩기 롬바다야 다와 로치다 아니는 다와 소미고요. 현동 다와 쪽소는 주시조가 되지 까와체네 아니 럼든다 고종을 최주와 팩 디팩네 라마셀링바제 라마셀링바자네 아니 럼든다 고종을 최니 슈 디니 슈네 투키와 디바이자 기시 체감에게 마 송양기 매막 두진이고 태고적으로 좀 비추기 매막 두진이고데 규바 가네레라는 셀링바의 규바에 있어 라마 셀링바 네 수규바에 있어.
So then next we have this line. We could say it's the sort of essential nectar of the oral instructions, which comes from the lineage of Serlingpa. So here, when it comes to the kind of oral instructions, this is referred to as a sort of essential nectar, or we could use the word amrita. And this amrita or nectar generally is said to have, there are many types, but having these three qualities of bestowing deathlessness, right, eliminating death. As well, there is a kind of nectar or amrita that eliminates illnesses, eliminates our sicknesses, as well as the kind of quality of increasing one's realizations. And so this kind of nectar or amrita has the ability to eliminate those kinds of adverse negative conditions, as well as to enhance any kind of positive qualities or realizations which one has. And so this then is referred to as like the essential nectar or essential amrita, in that this training in bodhicitta is the real essence of these oral instructions. And the next line then gets at the origin of this. This isn't something without an origin, although it was Geshe who composed this, wrote this down. He didn't just come up with it himself, it didn't come from nowhere, but rather he received these teachings from Joel Atisha, who in turn received them having traveled for maybe as long as like 15 months, enduring many difficulties in order to get to the island of Sumatra. He met with the teacher Serlingpa, from whom he received these instructions regarding the stages of the path, and particularly the generation of the awakening mind. And it was then Atisha who carried on those instructions and then were bestowed upon Chekoa, who composed this.
Loma Silingbegi Loma Jojo Badi Adisha se Konglaya Ane Tegochungu Doma Chu Ni Za Chungu Ni Kongla Yubare. That Tegochungu Doi Chu Delaya Lambrim the Lozong Chu Ni Kongla Yubare. Lambrim Chu Di Chanju Lambi Juma se Tina Sungore. Lozong Chu Di Lozong Tendu se Tenduma Yigama Pangyan di Pangme Sache Tone Pangdin Sunkin di Chekawa Redi Kang Sumyan di Jeja Lozong Tendun se Tendun Chol Masu Choyo Sukare Choyo Dama Chakore Ta Dili di Chol ne Lozong Tenduma di Mama Chen Gishi Chekawa Che Dili Mama Chen ne Dagi Ta Lame Chen Lama Narangia Lama Re Saga Jawa Ishin Korea top Jawa Ishin Korea Zane Gen Tamolosan Gazu Chola top Gen Tamolosan Gazu Ile Malaya Lungda Ani Sheba Chazan Jitani Konke Denu Namba Tantaki Shushi Tantani Selin Bani Cuba Ishi Cuba Gama Odi Kena Kemur Roa.
So, Serlingpa's student, Atisha, then possessed these precious instructions of the stages of the path, the Mahayana mind training as well. He had as well all the kinds of precious instructions of both Sutra and Tantra. But among these, again, the teachings of the Sutra, the Mahayana mind training teachings, were ones that he had received from Serlingpa. And in turn, although he composed the lamp of the path, those teachings with regard to the teachings of the stages of the path, these teachings of Mahayana mind training were not something that he wrote down. Rather, they were orally passed, and it was Geshe who actually wrote them down together with the outline. Now, in terms of they continued on, being passed from one teacher to another. And it was my own great teacher, Geshe who passed them to Lobsang, who in turn gave me all of the kind of instructions and give the transmission of these teachings of the Mahayana mind training. And so knowing the kind of lineage and how this is passed from one master to another is important for you to know.
이 미나와 참고해 이 다기 계획심이 좀 개통으로서 계속하는 슈드장과 개인기 분들의 메토가 시작하는 게 마티어리 이 테스 고림다 센터 테스트다 이거です.
So there are some slight variations terms of the root verses of this text. So the one that is available in Tibetan, we are using that one in particular because this is the version that was transmitted to me from my own teacher, Lobsang. So that is why we are using this particular version. And although there are maybe slight differences in the order, the essential meaning is the same.
Oh yeah. That time, that one, Tangi Gangde. Mema duzi nyingu lawa so lojong de me che de la mema duzi nyingu so tindegi be keje shawo ya gi phen kayo yende kayo re sana lojong de me lojong che de la ani yende de la ji yende keba yende ni ji yende de doji ni ma ju shin shin shong de lo so she ba cha che keba yende de
So here, in terms of, again, we have this line that says the essential nectar of the oral instructions. Well, these have two kind of qualities. We could say a general kind of quality to them, which comes then in the two lines. And again, I'm sorry, this is not in the English, but that I will explain the meaning of this text, which is like a vajra, the sun, or a medicinal tree. That is referring to the kind of general qualities. And then the second two lines, which say, through this proliferation of the 5 degenerations, transforming every event into the path of enlightenment, refers to the particular kinds of qualities of this.
Oh yeah. That the doji said, doji chibu, doji mare. The doji said, doji palam, diamond. So doji palam laya de, toto chibuta shibu. Gipe chujung de zame, chujung jima inaya, za chibu zine. Chimarazo, chibu singela ta, juya, amjola daya, de genja, which is chibu. So doji se doji palam che doji palam chebuda yinda yin tana yin chujungye je ne ani be jige palam te za jibu shu sibi yore doji palam chujungye je de yang Geshe se ul tezu changma sibi yore oda korala ya ti yende ni do 도저 파람이 입에 차네 자충고 유연된 책 아니 세다 뭐로 소배 진진신 습는 봐 되게 계획이 와 디나시 우 태고처럼 로종 되는 주 용조다 따지면 디 차시 고도 장주를 세운 것만 하고 자만 인증 것만 하고 되게 장 아니 자충고 지다 신 태고면 최 소래 키보드 봐봐. 대제기 수고. 대 도저 파업다 다. 니마세 니마 키보드 따지면 니네 자신의 배는 자신의 신동주에서 너무에서 지어야 되면 시작이나 니네 자신 가봐셔서 되나? 아니 세배 차이가 마세 너무 탐제 매버스가 돼야 도와. 로 파게 통투의 연대 가라. 아니 너무 매버스가 연대 도와. 디나시 태고처럼 로좀 추에 대라야 랑이를 연대가로 마제바 게 공부도 따면 계줘요 마세 랑이 생긴 나는 예배 괜히 참 설레게 계줘야 되겠어 다 준신세 다가 준신 말에 매기 준신 생인데 매기 준신이 동보다 매기 준신이 양가다 매기 준신이 로마 존재 아니 매서용도 아니 도와생전담기 아니 류기 또 개와서 배 류를 나서 상마 매버서 배 미요래 디당시 개고축을 로족을 쳐야 돼 냥내 제가 있나 랑기 유래야 연대가 마이게 개고 공부해마다 괜히 차 당신다랑 진짜로서 영어 탐제 아니 매버서 계속 근데 이사 태고축을 로족을 쳐야 돼 도제 파범다 니마다 매기 준신당 자와이스 텐데기 드라이브의 슝드게 아니 계란 아마 시리 계란 준비야 시발 자수 샤르고 시사시 시발 자 하고와 제수 소스.
So here I have said Vajra, but really this word we shouldn't take as like the implement of the Vajra, but as being like a diamond, which is another translation. And so here a diamond is considered to be extremely precious. I mean, it doesn't have to be a huge diamond, but even something quite small is considered to be very precious. Like we use this in our ornaments and jewelry and so forth because of its beauty and its preciousness. And so not only is this like a diamond in terms of being precious, no matter how small the little part of it might be, but it is also the case that like a diamond, it sort of outshines any other kinds of ornamentation, whether it's gold or silver or whatever it is. When you have a diamond, that kind of steals the show. That is the most sort of beautiful thing. And so of all the various instructions, particularly including those of the Hinayana or the Pali tradition, these instructions of the Mahayana mind training outshine that. They are like a diamond in that way. And so too, they are like a sun, right? When we think about the sun as a whole and the kind of light that it provides, that's one thing. But even just when we have like one little patch of darkness, if we have sunlight come in there, it eliminates all of the kinds of darkness that is there, right? It allows you to be able to see. And so too, when we have these instructions, they have the ability to illuminate for us what is there, and also to eliminate the kind of darkness, the sort of darkness within our own mind. It is able to remove or eliminate that kind of ignorance. And then we have it being likened to a medicinal tree. So not just a tree, but like a medicinal tree. Wherein when we have some kind of tree that is medicinal, every single part of it, the trunk, the branches, the leaves, the roots, are all beneficial. They all have the kind of capacity to be able to, when you take them, increase the strength of the body, the health of the body, and to be able to eliminate the kind of illnesses that one might be suffering from. And so too, like a medicinal tree, these instructions of the Mahayana mind training allow you to develop the kinds of positive qualities that you have not yet developed, to enhance and increase those that you have developed already, and to be able to eliminate those sorts of illnesses, like our self-cherishing attitude, grasping at a self and grasping at and that sort of self-cherishing attitude. And so, like a diamond, the sun, and a medicinal tree, these instructions on the Mahayana mind training, particularly this 7-point mind training, has the ability to, like those examples, kind of eliminate those things which are negative qualities, outshining the qualities of lesser vehicles, and allowing for you to be able to develop all positive qualities.
니마마 도와디 저절로 교와 인스디 개발기 개주 노종이 때문에 개발기 개주 소말에 제작기 개주 나들라 니마마 개랑도 토지겠다 마주지야 니마마 대한 다가게 마주지다 아이 니마마에 나와 니마 방배에 세 니마스 어세 세자들이 사진 세제 내가 대쇼분들라야 명문스티 당고디 세 니바 명문티 아수바데라야 셈제 시바데라야 듀 다시 듀사 나한테 나무데라야 따와티 라카다 따와스 데소와 어때 제가 됐을 니마스가 세예가 장가들라 어디고 세세지 어디고 한번 니마가 뭐죠?
So here, then, when it comes to the proliferation of the 5 degenerations, here we should make a note of these 5 degenerations. So the first of these is in terms of lifespan. Then the second is in terms of our afflictions. The third is the degeneration of sentient beings. The fourth is the degenerate era in terms of time. And then the fifth is the degenerate era in terms of ideology or views.
다 되어야 당부 닝마 시베기 산야다 냐교 니카세 니마 그러도가 이 닝마세 가르에서나 당부 빼지거리라 빼 나라도 용다리야 빼나 차다고 꼴기다 나 차배 좋아요 차배 쥐요 자시고 데리지 추나로 안 추나로 저 꼴그러 와 빼나 배자에 쉬고 꼴그러 와 제가 꼴용데 당부 자기기 자기기 연대 상고 정말 쉬고나서 상고 되거든 나한테는 잡고 대문제 막 되게 꼴왜 쉬고 되나 아니 자기 연결줄 거야 이런 추나 거나 안 가래 대시라요 말 주상은 양사 연대 상고 조사 나 가능하더래 자유로도 왜다 도시적으로 자유인증만 자유인증만하면 자기 주유당 상부상만 떠연사네 딱 타만 패만 자유용된 자유인증만을 놓아 어디남신 단절되어야 인망 쇠되라 지당하여 빼나 당고 새 인망 쇠되 나나무 이마이나 새로 배거나 기장승이라고 새로 문자승이라고 새로 배 똥자승이라고 딘지기 배 새배 내가 강요 배주시해주고 하라 나한테서 미수는 마냥냥냥 세대야 마마마마 두루두루두루두루 나 다들 시대 새로 개발하다 로자마도 대마도야 망타나 야야나스 대마도 대마창으로 디카레 세야가 참만 좋아를 누가 되는데다 어디는 세인가 주소 반디 쇼그데야 뇽닝마세 가리마나 나나베기 뒤에 개발상도 뒤에라 뇽 끼고요 얘는 뇽 참모들이 충충들이 뇽뇽들이 끼고 다야 미망스는 마마냐 뇽깨야 이게 뭐치 대자깨야 시방깨야 뜨무깨야 타오깨야 마마마들이 미소 상황 뇽배 라빠 뇽 숙청고 뇽 도셔만 내가 이래서 뇽님만 이 저거도 나만 마야를 해서 뒤져다 동력 진이 진도로 대상마야를 가서 아메리카는 이런 마야를 미사일 거를 쉬우도 방문을 그래도 대장이네 쳐 시방이네 쳐 타고 전선 쳐 이렇게 참여해서 뇽님마스 아디는 심진님만 나이 가려면 너무 미도 심진이 주제되기 세바상고 시행하려고 미쳐봐 예를 들어서 나와요 단정상 미도도 되는 싸움을 도자기하냐 영웅 라베가 내용을 잡아 나만 민하신이 예를 들어서 세바상고 되고 이제 심진기나는 심진 도시를 잡고요 다자가 때문에 이제 딱 새로 개비 미도로기 제도 아니 그런 게 말아서 상계시에 다 만다와 다자가 때문에 만수세를 만수체를 몸을 하고 있었고요 어떻게 되겠어요? 땅하다 생제님만 되게 님만수는 되게 차례다 도시에 대해가 예상 되게 님만 빨리 님만 따와 나나무 이게 미술계 따와 계단이라 대상의 미술계 따와 계단 이게 노용도 대상의 따와 계단도 노요 확보돼야 따와 상보다 예방이 따와 예방 슈체야 따와 예방라야 따와 로또 슬라면 수수료 조단에 따오는 거 그러나 대상이 나야 예를 조성 지르면 따와디 만케니 지금에서 하나 되고 가는 책이 있으니 먹도 최기 따와 케리메스 아 깨워가지 따와 케리메스 레귤리 따와 케리메스 제 따와 상담단계 따와 누르도와 대대에서 따와 님마 세 님마 소리 두슈되게 님마가서는 도시들을 만데 그래서 도시가데 당시와나시 세 도시 뇽 도시 심진 도시 뒤 도시 따 도시 된적인 증가되라 아니 님마가 세 아니 님마가 무슨 님마가 거쳐서 님마가 도와서 아무것도 도와서 패로 축적을 쳐 님마가 도와대에서 닝망하게 대대로 축초야 패로에 뒤즈디라다 닝망하고 도와대라 패로데스 나 대다로 로종의 양내 약이여나 치료가 닝망나 가져야 되잖아요 수수생수수기 답은 양내 로종 양내 체는 내용들 닝망나게 교회에 소소가 거고요 그러와 더도 대다라 개념과 상만 상의의 고방탑에 이 탐론과 유구 대대에만 인사 닝망하고 도와데스 정주를 말에 대해 수수기 양내 로종의 양내 개체의 정주 라자메의 약간은 저의 정주 상의의 고방탑에 탐론과 유르토가 있다 어떤 닝망하고 도에 뒤에 대대책이라 개념과 탐제 정주 라네 정주 터에 탐론라 유르토야 돼 강한 때에 유르토를 나는 로종 비추에 되라 때는 유르토를 해서 대대에서 로종 비추에 되라 투모마이의 케이스 되어를 쏘라 다세요 그래서
So here, then these two lines, and this is actually at the end of like Tupinjipa's translation. It says, "Through this proliferation of the five degenerations, transform every event into the path of enlightenment." So here again, we have these five degenerations, and when it comes to like giving an example of this is maybe more appropriate for Tibetans, but when we boil tea, like when you initially boil tea, you use that, especially if you're making like puja, Tibetan tea, you need to boil that really well. And at the beginning, when you boil that tea, it's going to have all of the kind of nice smell to it, the sort of nutrients, or we could say the sort of essence of that tea. It's really nice. But then if you take that tea and boil it again and again and again, you get to sort of like when you're boiling the dregs of the tea, it's no longer going to have the same qualities as when you were putting that fresh tea in the water and boiling it. And so we can sort of think of like this time of degeneration, these various degenerations, as being like when we're sort of boiling the dregs of the tea. And so here, when it comes to the first of these lifespan, it used to be that beings had much longer lifespans, hundreds of thousands of years, even thousands of years. And now we have moved into the decline, like because due to the decline in the merit of sentient beings, we now live in an age where the maximum lifespan is maybe 100 years. So that is the first of the degenerations, is that of lifespan. And then there is that of the afflictions. And so here, during a more sort of good time, and not this sort of time of decline or degeneration, yes, beings gave rise to various afflictions, but not with the same kind of strength or magnitude as they do today. So we can think about the kinds of attitudes of like hatred and anger and pride and attachment and jealousy and so forth. They're so much more coarse. They're so much worse in terms of the kinds of afflictions that we have. We can look at this in terms of the way that even like we fight wars. For example, in the past, although we had afflictions and yes, we got into conflicts with one another, we used things like swords and knives, where you couldn't create the kind of destruction that, say, we see today in the wars that we are fighting, like the U.S. against Iran. You can drop bombs and kill thousands of people, right, in one strike. And so, just in terms of the degenerations, our afflictions have gotten so much stronger, so much more coarse, we could say. And so, too, then sentient beings have degenerated in terms of, in the past, in a sort of better time, they might have had a respect for good conduct and kindness, whereas that is something that is very much in decline. We have become less invested in acting well, treating each other well, and demonstrating that good kind of ethical conduct. And it is actually the case that the Buddha Shakyamuni prayed to be born in an eon with these sorts of degenerate beings in order to especially help those who are so sort of coarse and vulgar and difficult to deal with. And so here, this is then again, the fourth of the degenerations is this of time. In terms of the time that we are in, it is a very bad kind of a time. These are all sort of interlinked with one another. And then we can turn to the degeneration in terms of views or ideologies. Again, we have all of us, sentient beings. Generally, sentient beings, we have afflictions. But these days, there's more sort of elaboration or conceptual elaborations add on to or exaggerate the kind of negative qualities in terms of the way that we think. There are many more who say like, oh, I don't accept religion, or I don't accept karma, cause and effect. And due to the kind of ideology, the views that they hold, that in turn enhances the sort of bad conduct, the sort of negative activities in which they engage, and the afflictions in turn proliferate. And so here, this is sort of like we're in the worst of the worst, this sort of the term degeneration, and it is translated here as this proliferation. These have increased more and more. And so here, however it may be that this time is one of great degeneration, it becomes more and more important for us to take hold of our own mind, to work on and engage our own mind. And we can kind of use these as conditions to transform into the path of enlightenment, as it says in this next slide. So transform every event into the path of enlightenment. So we can use these negative conditions as sort of fodder to be able to transform them into our positive qualities. Use this into something and so how is it that we go about this? Well, we go about this through the kinds of instructions of mind training, using the conditions with which we meet, however negative they might be, in order to enhance and develop our good qualities.
아니 신기 원충화를 같이 해도 어떤 기능으로 해야지도 지수이다.
So here in our audience today, many of you have come and many of you are young, so I'm going to say something in particular to you all.
상기 추라야디 추기다 제라고 모종 셈 되당세게 추기 상기 송요와 네 가지다고 지요레 라베나 베디 샤베나 마라도 라바리아 파르체스 조와 저 파르체스에디 파르게야디 따다도 포토 미신 파르게야디 다이나 파르갸담디 파르야부갸 파르두자야 나서 지어라 딱 파르갸담 치디 파르체 요가체 파르체 디야 사베 파르칸리치게비네 우리 니스도 참아 갸토야기 느버요체 안디가야 파르체디 파르갸담디 로종 파르갸담 카리스갸비네 로종야 요가체 아니 디가야 파르무시게야 그거들라 렌스 디탕주어와 오디야 야부체 이제 요가이나 아니 파르체디 파르칸리치게비네 파게카리 요가디 타파치 통토야지 아니 지기고도와 이 맛에 아니 렌스 디탐디 게베 아니야 파게 파르지 파게 통야디야 교로도와 렌스 디탐디 딱 마노소나 파르디 마 세브메바 마테바 게데 파테르나야 또또 테야 잠르네요 야 파르지 렌스에 디탐 야쿠지 좀바이나 아니야 파게 우리 니즈다 참메토네 파르디기 타카 테트에요 제가 먼저 파르케스에 되라 이제도와 오디다 먼저 셈스에 니데 셈스니에 파르체도요 수수 셈스니에 수수기 파르체도체 아 파르체라 파르테비아기 네버이가 나시 먼저 셈라 시작 간리지에나야 셈도야다 시도야 네버리 셈 프로그램 아 내가 셈디 파르체도지 샤네 아니 파르체 딕담 렌스 딕담 라바나시 먼저 셈기 아니 렌스 딕담디 따당지어와 이 시험 드려요 셈기 파르체기 토네 렌스 딕담디 나와 대자기 토네 찍딩이 때나 양 따당 통당 내려오죠 시당기 토네 렌스 딕딩이 때베나 양 통당 내려오요 근데 많이 맞지. 자마다 인지기 쌤기 빠질 때 지나도는 데는 양 통로 매달죠. 정주 쌤기 돈에 렌스 지금 따면 매달죠. 똥이 따와들 전에 양 때에는 양 통로 매달죠. 그래서 네가 상기 중년들에게 만들어야 상기 취해도 로종 취해도 송해야지 가르송되고 가나 결혼기 쌤기 빠지기 딕당기 야구집 디고리스 무인유소도 참다 디고리스 대니 결혼기 뭔데 야구 통보리스 가와 때려나요 포지티브 야구냥냥 통해야지 발기 인민수 뭐만 가리기만 딱딱 시행해주고 우리라 그래서 상기 취해야 돼 로종을 와야 돼 즉 가려야만 쌤기 빠지 딕당도 그거리스
So here, the Buddha Dharma in general, and in particular these teachings on mind training, we could look at it through this kind of example of taking a picture, right? If you have a camera in your hands, that camera has the ability to take a picture that will be just how you want it, or that will accord with what the reality is, what you are seeing. So we have the camera that has that ability to function, and if you then study, you know how to properly use that camera, and then when you actually go out to use it, you use different sort of lenses, right? If we are properly able to know how to use those lenses, then we can take a picture in the way just how we want it, right? We are going to be able to focus it properly and use the kind of lens that we need in order to get the picture that we want. And so too, when it comes to our own mind, what we see is really going to be based upon our use of our mind. So when it comes to our mind, it is sort of like a camera. It has the capacity to know any kind of object, but we need to understand on what lenses we are using and know how to use them properly in order to be able to have that kind of understanding of things as they are. So within our mind, if we put on the lens of attachment, say, the thing that we see is going to be influenced by that. Or so too, if we have the lens of anger or hatred, what we see through our mind is going to be influenced by that. We will see something differently. Instead, if we are to use the lens of, say, love and compassion, this attitude of bodhicitta, that will influence what our mind sees. If we use the understanding of emptiness as our lens, that is going to influence the way that we perceive these various objects that we turn our mind to. So knowing how to properly use our mind to be able to see the good in things, to be able to know in accordance with reality, is dependent upon our learning how to properly use our mind. That it has the capacity to know these various objects, but we need to understand how it is that the kind of lens that we put on influences what we actually see.
따들어야 니 계란도로 고대와지 니 슈바이나 둑사지다 약사지 배나 도와다는 슈바이나 딱 예sem기 다른 계란도로 뜨거워 제니 따요 그래서 니 미기타비로 통구도 와 얘네 셈되면은 미리들이 가야 통해요 말다 저 따존에 딱인데 셈기 미기 돈이 찍다고 하래 나의 돈이 찍는 거 너무 돈이 찍혀가시는 거 가야 돈을 로직는 거 싸워도 셈을 제가 딱 셈기 돈에 노스는 계란도 맞다요데 누가 지도 야근이 계란도 소부가 마 지때 샤도가 차게 때 내가 좀 전에 동네에 막 송대야 동네기 동네 교회 동네 자부지 동네 애들 저기 얘기 결혼소리에 니장장 됐다 나라는 이나야 니 통에 따 되는 원래 단에 참마 레다 명공기 샤원제레샤 동네베랑 신제샤 코바스인데 닝구메바레샤 도자레샤 견도 니도 님이 고리게 애니장장 좀 통그래 그러와 제가 니 생기 따당 찍기도 와. 따야 생기 따당 찍기 계란속이 니 생기 현수 수분을 받아왔지. 현수 셈받다. 난 기본적으로 쌤 되라야 내가 그 쌤지요. 내가 시작하면 소바들이 아니 왕 시험을 아빠들이 내가 맞아왔지. 계속 그 쌤기 랑신 되는데 기본적으로 쌤기 랑신데 상기가 쳐나 쌤기 랑신 왜 세와세 쌤기 랑신 나만 타빠제 쌤기 랑신을 저요 말해제 쌤기 랑신이 왜내 계제시나 쌤기 탐제 예상 개발에 상계 차례 쌤기 탐제의 쌤기 랑신 터두들이 저만 매매 나가나신래 좀 전에 송만 나신 얘기하고 예 쌤기 통해 뒷발제들이 계란 속에 수불마다 제 계란 속에 쌤기 랑신 터두 뉴마리지께로 왔어 로 대대이 매매 따라 니 계속 상기 통도다 니 계란 속에 수고 샤더를 차 동해 대대도에 따라 코와 님이 깨지 그러는 거야 제가 쌤기 따뜻하게 터네 통니 통도 시치가 미치기가 따뜻하게 터네 니 통도 독자통해야지 양통해야지.
So here, to give another example to kind of illustrate this clearly, there's a way of looking at sort of the bad of things or the good of things. So when I look out and see all of you, I see you through my eyes, but without the mind, there's no perception of that. So the mind is really the root. Although we see various forms with our eyes and hear sounds with our ears and smell with our nose and so forth, it is the mind that processes this. This is the root of all of the kind of perceptions that we have, whether it's good or bad. And so if I look out at you all and look at your bodies composed of flesh and blood and bones and so forth, I can see that as an example, an illustration of the truth of suffering. The fact that we all undergo the various types of suffering, like the suffering of transformation, the suffering of conditioned existence. I can perceive that through the lens of looking at how there is no essence to any of these phenomena within samsara, seeing the fault of samsaric existence. And so too, if I, instead of looking at your bodies of flesh and blood and contemplating on that, but look at you in terms of your mind, and not just the sort of temporary minds that you have, the minds of attachment and anger and ignorance and so forth, but really looking at the nature of your mind, the nature of mind as being clear light, as being something that is not polluted by those kinds of adventitious defilements or temporary stains, but has this capacity for Buddhahood, that all sentient beings, actually the ultimate nature of their mind is like a clear sky, free of clouds, without any sort of impurities or faults in it. And thereby, looking at you in that way, I can look out and see all of you as like Buddhas, rather than seeing the kind of faults of samsara and looking at it as through that sort of bad lens. There is this very good way of looking out at all of you, and it is very much dependent upon the kind of lens that we use in order to look at beings. So there's that kind of way in which you could look at things as bad or look at them as good. Even that one single object, a single basis, can have those different perceptions.
Today, when you do that, Sangi children taking Maratolea, Matu Tama, similares. Yine sosu diye sen teki sosu la tayo na ya tadam tela ane tadam norwa tadam yang takwa sosu mi sheda la tagi mai na ya tadam norwa tadam yang takwa denje mambu yor das yine maratu mambu chigi kyawa bunja mambu deja shana temu damzi ramchinzi tela khombe wangi 쌤기 따당데 양심 멘두스 로아 타키라도 덴데 마체스 카 멘두스 타키라도 저기 깨워 망고네 아니 담제다 진제다 데자 셰다 티무 덴데기 시험도 소네 따데지도와 티유로 당시스 따원네 단에게 최근에 무의미수도 사배도네 제 랑가 시행을 편도요가 지다 내가 더더로 편도요가 지다 조조 아니 최근 무의미수 심어지시 당요가 니 아니 쌤게 따당 시행을 주고레스 딩에 만납기 Islamne, Saki Jomne, Mazula, Simki Pa, Tadang, the Hilapo. Jera Uzong Chena, so Dilap.
So, as the Buddha has taught to us, we all have minds, right? And in the same way that when we look at other beings or other external objects, there are different ways of seeing. So, too, when we examine or look at our own minds, there are different ways of seeing. There's a mistaken way of seeing and a kind of correct or proper way of seeing. So, there's this different views that we can take based upon the kind of focus or our way of looking at it. So, due to our habituation through many lifetimes, too, these various kinds of afflictions, our anger, our attachment, our ego grasping, our self-cherishing, and so forth, we have a way of seeing our mind that is very much polluted by or influenced by those kinds of afflictions. But there's also another way of seeing your own mind that is based upon that it accords with reality, accords with the kind of potential of that mind. It is a way of seeing that is much more beneficial to us, that is much more helpful to us. And so I'm not saying this just myself, but this is really based upon the teachings, that if we study and learn, we can understand how to see differently our own mind.
Okay. Just today, by Yanzata, Simgi, Tadam, Simgi, Samutandam, Uduzuteli, Lojong, Chedi, Katsu, Tesam, Yakuchana, Diakushingri, and Yamne, Katsu, Yakuchana, Diakuyoris.
So, based upon our way of looking at the mind and sort of seeing our own mind, we can train our minds, particularly through these mind training teachings, to look at our mind in a way that is much more helpful.
Honest, that didn't want to do that I get something in my sea. Nipa, Pardu Gewa, Shumbema, Dista, Lojongi, Shumbema, Tangi, Dotenka, Shevanashi, Dunsha. That doing none, do Tango, Mondo, Dingy Church, Tabanis, such a delay. Mondo Dingy Church, the mass. That you want to think the church of a say, Mondo like the shepherd, Geshe, natural from Julia Majocha, Mondo Lobsang, Mondo Bushi Tango. Mondo like the Mushila, turn Mondo Sushila. Jesaka, better Kawali and Mondo Mushi jail. Church Yamin, Kadechina, Mondo Mushi jail. They Tanda. Lojong de Chu, Shirishane, Lojong de Chu, Mushi de Gadana, Tanzania, and Chanju Semi Lojong, Tewachu, Chanju Semi Lojong. Then take Chanju Semi Lojang, Mushi, Shane, Ti, Mama, Dobu, Church, Mondos, Jana didn't want to think the church said, Nipa. Mushi Chanju similar Lojong, he, Mondo, and it Mondo Chudis and Kisumioris.
So, picking up from where we have left off in the text, and this here in this version says second, from as far as the actual meaning of the text. Here it is teaching the preliminaries. So this first point says a presentation or teaching of the preliminaries, which are the basis. So here it is, some just go think that this text begins straight right here, but actually the actual text, the actual meaning of that is preceded by these preliminaries. They are preliminaries to the basis, which is the actual text of training the mind in the two awakening minds. And so here it says that first one should train in the preliminaries, and they are preliminary to that actual text, which is training the mind in these two awakening minds.
Oh, that Tango, Mondo, Dengi Church, Mass, the other Lojong to them and Zawa, Sikan Chima to your man. That Sikan Chim Garesana, you can not so what they Tango Mondo Tala Lop, that Pensi Taya, Tango Mondo Tala Lop, that Pensi Taya, Ibadu, that's a check.
Tibetan version, the actual line from the root text is in bold, and for us in English, if we have one version, it might actually be the opposite of that. But the actual first line of the root text itself is first train in the preliminaries. We should understand this to be the first line of the root text itself.
Oh yeah. That didn't allow Tango Mundo Talamas, Tango Lava, the Tango Lava, Garela, Tangishua Nashi, and a Lojong Pichu, Yella, Dom Yana, Sajesum. 당모 나와다 통말 나와대 집에서 통매체 내내 바로도 의식이체 아니 주디 제스 소미고 뒤에다 다다 될라 당모 라이브도 잡아 의식 아니 태고점으로 장주도 세미라로 정화 디데데 람상 겁마겨스 겁냐면 마치스 계란이 리물라 당모 뭐라 집에 당모라 뭐라 지금 당보 계란이 로종게 먼저 다가 럽스되다가 태성 bomba 제소 당보 먼저 위치라 태성 bomba 제 당 먼저 위치가 직마이마 망부여가 인자 타타 먼저 다가 럽스 당 먼저 다가 럽스데 먼저 위치 망부여로 고도와 딱 가져야되잖아.
So here this line says first train in the preliminaries. First, and again, when it comes to the sort of breakdown of the text in general, we have the kind of introduction, the first part, the main body of the text, and then the conclusion. But here, where it's saying first, it means that prior to, before training the mind in the Mahayana mind training, as in developing the two awakening minds, one needs to train in the preliminaries, and there is a pluralizer there because it's not just one single thing, but rather one needs to train in, as in here, learn about, contemplate, and meditate on the various preliminaries. And so here we will go through them individually. Generally there are 5.
당문도 달라시고 문도 위치에 맞잖아. 당부 신이 된지 당부의 가래에서나 신이 된지 아니 이거디 대조로체 숨어디 치와 메타바체 시버디 레뷰데체 나바디 코리니믹스 니중들에 나
So these 5 then are first relying upon a virtuous spiritual friend. Secondly is our human life, our precious life of leisure and endowment. Third is contemplating death and impermanence. Fourth is the reflection on karma, cause and effect. And fifth is contemplating the defects of samsara.
다 대단해 당부 아니 신이 된지 다 대라 베베기 아니 그 남주 나라 도마니 나는 도에가라 신이 된지 스티베스다 뭐라 나이가라 아니 라멘네 조로 스티베스다 뭐라 이제 야람 이게 나라 지금 구루요 세들이.
So here, the first of these, and in English we sometimes say relying upon a virtuous spiritual friend. Really, among the two traditions of the Mahayana, the Sutra and the Tantra, in the Sutra we tend to use the term of relying upon a virtuous spiritual friend, and in the context of Tantra we say Guru Yoga, but actually they are the same term in the Sanskrit, Guru Yoga, like connecting with the Guru or teacher.
신이 된수라야 돼. 대통령도 계획신이 때문에 표현 가리오리에서 성도야지. 계획신이 때 괴괴 경쟁 때나 편도 가리오. 내가보다 표현 가리오. 북으로 표현 가리오. 어디 성도야 돼? 신이 때문에 표현. 마tem에 님이 당 띵수로도 님이라도 계획신이 마tem아 경가라고. 교육가요. 계획신이 때도 당시라 때당 너에게만이나 아니 녀박가요. 교육가요. 어디서 성다야 돼? 계획신이 맞대마 띵수로 이미 니체. 다 삼배 된수죠. 다 삼배 된수 해야 돼. 삼류 돈에 개회신이라 가졌을 때 거래. 삼류 돈에 가졌을 때 거래 나야 되나? 니 개회신이 삼류 돈에 개회신이 연대 삼내 대박이에요. 즉 개회신이 끝인 삼도안에 구십지 니 대박 그바 개회신이 연대 돈에 대박 끝인 제 그바 니니 냠는 지야 돼 아니 삼배 된지 조르에 된지 해야 돼 아니 류마기 락랭기 돈에 개회신이 돼야 돼 다 되라 아니 소소소놈 사베 체도 냐바상세로 아니 개회신이야 꾸르들로 젠다 요구교야 샤주시야 아니 저게 개회신이 가리 숨바디 랑기 나렌다야 까시도가 어디제네 가다 냐바상세로와 꾸르들로 제와 까시도가 어디 숨부디 조르에도네 류다마기 조르에도네 개회신이 된다 딱 두세네 개회신이 때 나야 되나 냠는체 소 디드레스 신이 때문에 마템마다 된줄들은 이미 사베든스 저레든스.
So here, in terms of relying upon a virtuous spiritual friend, there are different subtopics that come within that. And first is thinking about the benefits of properly relying upon a virtuous spiritual friend. What is the kind of, based upon understanding the purpose of that, what are the temporary and ultimate long-term benefits that we gain from proper reliance upon a virtuous spiritual friend? So the first topic is the benefits and of relying upon them, and then second is the defects of not relying upon a virtuous spiritual friend. What is it that we lose? What kind of loss do we have if we don't actually rely upon them properly, or we do so in a mistaken or misled kind of a way? So second is the defects of not properly relying upon a virtuous spiritual friend. And then the third topic is relying upon them by way of our thoughts, by how we think. So how do we rely upon them through thought? Is by thinking about their qualities. We generate faith in them as a spiritual teacher. And second is based upon recalling their kindness, generating a kind of reverence and respect for them. So that is the way in which we rely upon a virtuous spiritual friend through thought. And then there is through a sort of application or through our deeds, how we rely upon a virtuous spiritual friend in terms of our speech and in terms of our actions. And so there is the kind of activities involved in actually serving, offering service to one's teacher, taking care of their needs and so forth. And then there is the kind of taking up their speech into practice, the kind of advice and instructions that they have given us, we should accomplish according to how they have taught us. So those are the four main topics that come for that.
딱 개회신이 땡수가워야 도남적으로 시도와 딱 시기에 남내장 결정된제 싹 추실 냠내 예보도 제고야 돼 아니 수버들에 300땡수라 300땡수라야 대박다 그거 이미 나네 대박 그래서 딱 개회신이야 대박 장고를 놔야 되라 똑똑 미 머리는 대박 토리는 대박 머리는 대박이 개회신이라 이런 경우에 마다와 유대 경우에 따라 대박이 마다와 그러와 내내 토리라 이 대박 장미 전에 아니 말하는 개회신인데 오늘 상계랑 주간에 뭐 상계랑 그래 전에 라마 상계 수다에 대박 어디 검토는 야고 마 이까베나 라마 팅이 도시창에 뭐를 때네 대화적으로 와래 어디 다 너다가 니가 나라 냠내 야구 진이 질라 고야기 신이 되기 냠내 소리 되다 라마 상계 수다에 대박 라마 도시창에 대박.
So among these 4 points, the one that is really the most important, that is kind of indispensable, is the third of relying in terms of our thought and of the two points that come there, generating faith through reflecting upon their qualities, and generating respect based upon contemplating their kindness, generating faith, training in faith based upon seeing the qualities we can think of in two different levels. The lower sort of level is learning to look at one's teacher in such a way as you don't see their fault. You see their good qualities and train to have a kind of faith in them due to that. And then at a higher level is coming to see one's teacher as being a Buddha. And when we get to, and in the language of the Tantra, this is actually coming to see the teacher as in the nature of Vajradhara. So for someone who wants to be successful as far as practicing, properly relying upon a virtuous spiritual friend, thinking about them in terms of generating faith and seeing them as being like the essence of Vajradhara as a Buddha is the most important.
But never Geshe Samsumanya Lama Laya Sangis Tave Tevachika Lama Laya Doshon Tave Tevachi Chuanina the Digi Tevati Chene Penamaya Lana Marazo Namgu Kujusuma Kesuchi says the law. The Kujusuma Kesuchi Laya Dilla Nambe Tumai Mekapsuchidam de Ane Kujusuma Yendon Pesachores de Mare. Hindu ta Yishu Tenzori Susu God created la Kapsu Chila It did not Mare. Nambe Kujusuma Kapsu Chi Layati, Jacob Mitsu Kapsu. Jacob Mitsu Shalade Kujusumla, Ane Kapsu Duyati, Rangamon Kujusumla, Ane Kamuche, Kamuche, Ken Chene, Susu Seminala, Churkunjo Tobia. Susu Seminala, Churkunjo Tobna, Susu Gindukunjo Chaya, Susu Gindukunjo Chava de Yaki and Sangi Kunjo Chava. The Namasangi Kujusuma Kapsu Todam Monedi, Susu Rangi Yula, Kujusum Tobias, Kujusum Pasha and Zachu said Mare, Susu Kujusum Chaya, Susu Kujusum and then Tobias. The day is Lama Sangi Tave Tevata. Doshan Tave Tevati, Mune Yakuji Kiene, Yamechitona, Susu Yula, Kujusum Kapsu Do, Lawa Nashi, Tata Kujusum, Totu. The day you might use Marafu Doma Ije Nala, Ane Kampu Cheveka, Chelope Kabla, Sangi Tamji Dupe Ku, Doji Zibe Moini, Kujusum Sawate, Lama Chaso, Secretary. Lama Tevi Tevala Tene, Kunjusum Rama Tokuyosa, Soso Kunjusum Tomato Gizawate, Lama Tevada Nadi. The day ends up Kunjusum Gizawate, Lama Chafu, Sotati, and Yamini Buddha.
So here, this is an important point that I would like for you all to hold in mind. When we have this kind of faith in the teacher, whether it is seeing them as a Buddha or seeing them in the nature of Vajradhara, this is the kind of basis of going for refuge in the three jewels. As in, when we go for refuge to the three jewels, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, we are looking at their qualities, but it isn't in the same way that like non-Buddhists, say Hindu or Muslim or Christians, look up to this God or as being, they have such great qualities, I go for refuge to them. But rather, it needs to be this kind of faith that is connected with the idea of resultant refuge, that by going for refuge to those causal objects of refuge, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, you are sort of placing your faith in your own ability, your own becoming those three jewels within your own continuum. You are going for refuge to the Dharma that you will obtain in your own mind, that the member of the Sangha that you will become, the Buddha that you will become. So it is on the basis of recognizing that due to developing this kind of faith and this idea of refuge, you yourself will become, you will actualize those three jewels. This is something that we should recognize is really an important component of going for refuge. It's what distinguishes or really makes Buddhist refuge, both in terms of the Sutra and the Tantra. We do this kind of practice of resultant refuge. And so there is a verse verse that praises, it says, like, I prostrate to the Lama, who is the root of all refuges, the holder of the Vajra, and the essence of all of the Buddhas. And this is the recognition that, again, the root of the refuges, in terms of the refuge that we will actualize within ourselves, is the Guru themselves.
This one? At the end, Tata, Shin Yuki, Chue, Yaku, Yundu, Karichako, Lojomara, Susu, Samlo, Tone, Gave Shinela, Kandis Tower, Tadam de Lapu, Gave Shinela, Getting one of others, Yunding one of us, Chuna gave Shinela, Sangela, Dojachanta, Lojomba, they are Lojom Nenga, Lojom Kandis, Shin.
So here, in terms of properly relying upon a virtuous spiritual friend, we train our mind, right? This is a mind training kind of dharma that involves, there's a side where we could look at the faults of the guru, or looking at their qualities, looking at them in terms of their being a Buddha, they're having the kind of essence of Vajradhara and so forth. And so this is a way in which we have to train our minds, develop and train our faith.
Oh yeah. That in a issue that I want to choose money, Tambuta. I never be danger. That danger you choose the Lojong choose the job. They can't do it. Mamson Dam, so the door they took on the me since home. The me the danger really, but want to also have a tambo. But then you have a Terway, George Sambe, Ludi Mahabu. But Terway, George Sambe, Ludi, Habonaya, Tencha, you Mahabu. The name Yaka Mahabu. Yang Sandi Jumendi, Kuran is Semis, Kerami Tanotove, me, Ludi, Dora to Nane, Ludi, Church, Ludi, Yashu. They are Tewa get a George of within the Terra Church, Pendo Chobu within Oh, the danger within the never the Tatu Niva of the Tencho Dutuin the Ludin the Tencho days. Danger within the Yamaya of Tokmatas, whether you more tiny one near Danger some don't the love you. Mansoya, Tenjur Kipo, Tadana, Samtan, oh, not me, you didn't talk about Leda, Mabe, Tewagera, George, you didn't talk to that. The day you talk about the name of Tatu Niva, the Tencha, Reduda. Or the day you didn't talk about the day, Maoba Yana, talk about Reduda. That's how you train the Susu, you didn't talk about the Samatan, Susu, you didn't talk about the Gawako. Gawako was Pesha Putane, Church, Pavetta, Nikule, Soso, the Wunderesha, Savajiki, Shire. The Yiba Niba, and then Tenjurki, Lojong said.
So then that is the first of these 5 preliminaries, and the next preliminary that should precede our training of the mind, that we also need to train our mind in, is that of this kind of life of freedoms and endowments. And so among the 6 types of beings, we have been born in a kind of happier migration, right? We need to have an understanding of the sort of freedom that we have, the 8 freedoms, the 8 states from which we are free, and the 10 kind of endowments or conducive conditions that we have. And recognizing that, we see that this kind of life that we have right now is something that is very meaningful. It is something very precious, and it is something beneficial in the sense that we can attain both temporary and ultimate objectives. Whatever it is that we might set out to do in terms of the Dharma, we have the capacity to do so on the basis of this kind of life. And so because we have that kind of body, it is something as well that is not attained all of the time. It is something that we don't always get this kind of situation, but rather is quite rare to have. So in order to really make use of this, we should put ourselves to the Dharma. We should make it meaningful. So first recognizing the kind of feeling a kind of joy at the fact that we have such a life right now that can be used for something so meaningful, we should, due to that recognition, put it to use, actually take up the practice of the Dharma.
대표는 무엇으로도 대표로서의 계제도 시작은 거기부터 시작이다. 왜냐하면 저는 내려가면서 상막이 수고 미를 토벼로 부인에다 부인에다 민수지 토벼로 그 미리 성도에 누가 되어 시작이라고 봐. 딱 만족이 미를 토벼에 민생 토벼. 나중에 뜸박이야 아니 미를 토벼에 셈 토벼. 지금 맨날 내가 기야 미를 토마리 셈토라. 딱 본주 미를 셈디다. 난저도 토베 미를 셈이 찍어. 딱 그런 쪽이 대조 성문다, 대조가 성문다, 니에가 성문다네. 그런 쪽이 류다 셈데 배제야 무슨 당시에 빨상게가 봐. 지금 나가고 셈데 패도. 난저기 류다 셈데 대대지 배제하고 마다 인상 다다만도 대대 하고요. 제가는 반드시 제가 뒤에 나도 수수부터 미리가 셈되라 수수기 상록이 따라는데 누구요? 대중 외소와 이거 된저와 이거 이거 상담고 말아. 아까 저번에도 내 마음까지도 마야 미 아니 제가도 상황 사이도 동부도 장기도 기본적으로 마야 되는데 자꾸 영웅장장 가고 로데와 인사 수수기 류셈로 수수기 따당 넣으네 미스터라고 나중에 때마다 주점면은 수수 류셈로 수수 따당이 양을 좋아 인사 딱딱 배저당이 존재되는 거야. 어디 제가 상당한 생일이 대중 짱짱지가 상당한 넣으나 괜찮고 양을 좋은 편도 전부 들어요.
So here, to put this in a way that is easy to understand, all of us have obtained this kind of human body, right? Whether we have the form of male or a female, a man or a woman, we have obtained this kind of body. And so too, we have the mind of a human, which has the ability to think on a level superior to other types of beings. We have that kind of intellectual capacity. And so when we think about it, the Buddha Shakyamuni, our teacher, he obtained this same human body, or Jetsun Milarepa as well. It was on the basis of this human mind and body that they obtained very great results. And so thinking about, and how did they do this, is in part by thinking about the kind of freedoms and endowments that they had, thinking about how greatly meaningful such a body was, how difficult to find, and actually applying themselves to the Dharma. Now, we are still here cycling in samsara because of the fact that we haven't really made progress in recognizing the kinds of freedoms and endowments that we have, how precious this life and how meaningful it is, and how difficult it is to find again. And so if we look around in the world and think, well, oh, look at all these other humans, they're getting all these things that are happy and so forth, and we just pursue those kinds of worldly aims, we are going to continue to sort of squander this precious opportunity that we have. But if we come to recognize the freedoms, the endowments that we have, how greatly meaningful this life is, just in a way, and how difficult it is to find, in the same way that the Buddha Shakyamuni, that Jetsun Milarepa did, we have the ability to make it so greatly beneficial. So on the basis of this life, this body, we can choose to do something that is very beneficial or something that is quite a loss.
대중기 꼴라 로조야고 전에 야고 고쳐가지고 중앙이나 수수기가 있나야 미세 토라만로야 돼야 아니 미세 토라만로 된다 봐 meaningful life 소야가 팬도요래 미샤가 스페나 파마이나 수수 보고다고 예예나 수수기 기루다고 조고조제나 수수 조고다고 양나네가 상로 정리 지리게 감되는 데는 배는 정리 들어가라 니 두주에네요 제가 한데서 저희들이 좋아하는 게 뭔가 쉬워져요. 이 단단히 대결 계속 조약고 제 소소만에 폴라타미면도 야구적으로 써놓고 용들 딱 미션만 너무 제게 수수기 미리도 폴라타미와 통용데 닝제 삼바 배사수 삼바 그리고 우도 그렇죠? 저는 드레이먼이 돼서 이 대결을 취해되기 랑라 편조체도에 이 니즈디 시작하다 제시하고 지금도 있나 근조된서 미리 사치고 모제체도나 미션다이나야 폴라모라 파마이나야 수수 부고리에 되고 망부시요 그렇죠? 어디에 제가 보고 돌아오고 셴백 미리 폴라던 게 카는다 방부시다.
So here, if we study well the kind of freedoms and endowments that we have, if we come to really understand that and have a feeling about it, then we won't squander our lives. We will make it meaningful. We won't let it go to waste. And this is really important, not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of others as well, like parents and their children, teachers and their students, our friends, and so forth. If we look around, I mean, in this world, there are over 7 billion human beings, and when we have studied and come to understand the very preciousness of this life of leisures and endowments, how difficult it is to find, then when we look around at others who are really wasting their lives, who aren't using them in a meaningful way, will give rise to a sense of compassion, like how sad, what a loss that they aren't using this in a meaningful way. And so our understanding of the kind of freedoms and endowments that we have will be beneficial in terms of our making our own life meaningful, but this is also something that we can then impart to others, introduce to others, like parents to their children, or students or teachers to their students, and to our friends and so forth, and likewise help them to make their lives meaningful.
Oh yeah. But then 먼저 수마 치워부터 하는 거래. 다 치워부터 해야 돼. 아니 조디 딱 대조선의 민위대 터바가 버려. 얘는 대조선의 민위대인데 딱 봐도 대박 강해요 말이지. 니만직 간다 시야 땡겨버리. 아니 같이 심하시니 하고요 말이. 시에 가려니 아니 죄라도 시행하기에 팽만이 세네. 강다 치워비다 배기 사모되기 가리로 종이고 그래서나 나라도 밀리 토바데 뒤딱 내기를 세네. 땅진이 시원하고 쏘네. 뒤딱 내기를 싸바데 사모동당 노주이 말해. 대개 사모동당 노주이를 유럽당네. 계란기 토샤베 미위데 대조기 땡상테 메다발레다스 에트코라 시에 땡케발레다스 대야베 남치 개발베발레다스 아니 시에 그로 대라야 류디 메라당그레 셈디 개발 청망을 주고리스 셈디 저에 그로 대라야 셈디 땡도 캐리아유베 슈 누바치 캐리아유나 안디 주에 캐리아요레스 이마도 류가 되베도네 노르상신 라소바 수수기 파마핀지 조조제가 소바 타나랑기 류이네 상샤 아니 도레스 두스마 삼노동다 딜라피요레 로종다 라피요레 치워메다.
So then the third of the preliminaries is the contemplation of death and impermanence, training our minds in this. And so we recognize that we have obtained this kind of body of leisures and endowments. We have this life right now, but it is not something that is permanent or that is stable and lasting, but rather we will definitely die, but we don't know when we will die. And at the time of death, the only thing that can be of benefit is our practice of the Dharma. So we have this kind of habituation due to our grasping at a self, this sense that we will be here forever. But we need to change our mistaken way of thinking. Although we might have a sense that we are going to die, we need to recognize that yes, it is is definite that we will have to die, but the time of our death is uncertain. And at the time that we die, the only thing that we can take with us really is our Dharma practice. When we die, we are going to leave our body behind, right? Although you might be cremated or buried or whatever, the consciousness will continue on, and your consciousness is going to continue along with the kinds of imprints and seeds that you have created through your practice of Dharma. And so even at the time of death, we have to leave everything behind, like all of the kind of wealth that we have accumulated, all of our friends and family, our parents and so forth, we have to leave those. Even our body will be left behind, but the only thing that we can carry with us is the Dharma practice. So then we arrive at the fourth of these preliminaries, which is thinking about karma, cause and effect. And this is where we get connected to the kind of three scopes of thought, or three types of being. So proper reliance upon a virtuous spiritual friend and the sort of leisures and endowments that we have, as well as thinking about death and impermanence are sort of the common preliminaries. And then we begin to go beyond that and think about karma, cause and effect. Here, again, going to the connection with the three types of beings, and sometimes in English you say like three scopes of being, but here we have the sort of small, middling, and great. And when we say like small being, or middling being, or great being, it doesn't have anything to do with their size, or like with their weight, how heavy they are, or how strong they are, but rather this is distinguished in terms of the strength of their thinking, the sort of scope or capacity of their thinking, whether it is being a small scope or a small being, middling or large. And just to back up this word being, which in Sanskrit is purusha, means it has the meaning of endowed with capacity. Like in a general term, we use the word being or sentient being to refer to a person, a being that is endowed with a mind, right? But when we look at the etymology of in particular the Sanskrit word, it has the sense of being endowed with capacity or potential. And so we can read that as every being with a mind has the capacity to become a Buddha. That is the sort of etymology of that term purusha. So every being has that kind of capacity, but based upon their current sort of scope of thought, we distinguish them. So if the scope of thinking is extremely limited, extremely small, they are a being of the small scope or a small being, and so too there is middling and great.
Oh yeah. Padema kiwu chung laya de samdongda chung bitone kiwu chung she. Ta samdongda chung de kare lana. Oh. 조조 빠져 아디샤기 장주 랑전아. 강시 탐내 강다기 거리 대화 싸움 달라. 랑이 된도 녀제와 기부 됐네. 탐을 시 소리. 기부 타마 기부 중 집을 제사마 기부 타마 기부 중 승인데 코로나를 타고 토바 지기 있어 선보야 하네. 아, 생제 탐지 위치도 상리고 토바 지기 있어 내려 선보 매와체. 코리 내와 썸지 대야 나랑 된다. 생기 된도 많이 봐. 나랑 된다라 코리 내와 썸마고도 내려 선보 관계인데 아니 기부 중 기부 타마 됐을 거야.
So here, a being of a small scope or capacity has sort of like a small way of thinking. And Joel Atisha describes this at the beginning of his lamp for the path, and I, as a translator, will not get it exactly, but that being who, by whatever sort of means or practice, is striving for happiness within samsara, as in striving for like a higher rebirth, they should be known to be a being of small capacity. So this kind of person or being has no thought of liberation from samsara, let alone the state of full Buddhahood, but rather they are thinking only of their own aims, their own happiness, and their own happiness within the cycle of samsara.
This one. Rani Bashi Chedo, Rani Kone Dodo, Rani Kone Dodo, Kuri Deva Tsam Doduni Lagi, Kuri Deva Tela, Sedi Kuri Deva, Kiwa Chime Kuri Deva, Mi. Rani Bashi Chedo, Sedi Kone Kuri Deva Doduni Sona, Di Kiwu Chumu Yiwa Mase, Kiwu Tama Yiwa Mase, Kiwu Chumu Samu Was Menta. 진짜 되게 최배의 나와 수고요. 남아산예배의 최배 나와 수고요 말해. 네 가래라는 세디 버시라 셴네 강사. 세디 버시라 현자 지인이 강사데 아니 최반 나와 수기 매바데 주승 잡아야게. 세디라 셴나 최반이 손을 어디
So here, a being of small scope is thinking only of themselves, for their aims and happiness alone. As Joel Atisha has said, striving for samsaric happiness, merely striving for samsaric happiness. So we can think about that in terms of the kind of happiness of this life, or happiness in a good rebirth in future lives. And so someone who is really only thinking about happiness within the scope of this life alone, and not even beyond this life, they are actually referred to not sort of as like or just as a being of small scope or an ordinary being, but a merely small being, like referring to the fact that actually they aren't considered to be within the ranks of practitioners. When you are only sort of clinging to and attached to the pleasures of this life and not even thinking beyond that. It is as it says in the parting from the four clingings, that if you are attached to the pleasure of this life, then you're not even a Dharma practitioner.
그것이 랑님 바시 체도 랑님 혼내 등도 이거죠. 얘는 주적이 코르웨이 세디 디기래 겨우 처음 벤지기 내가 개정했지. 세디다 처음 인천은 처음 개치를 상으로 코네 겨우 처음 대로 하다 미 고마 통나 하다 미 디기들 토그레스 덴데마 토바치기에서는 되는 강사수와 어디 기후 충분할 기후 충분함에 야가 되는가 기후 충분 개발지에 쓰고되라. denji 기후 충분 개발지인데 아니 신의 최배만 수고 간사람 세계 코로나가 시작한 돌아와 치마 병이 그걸 깨와 이 최배만 수고 다 최마 가르래라는 기후 충분이 최적인 거죠.
So here, someone who is only thinking about their own aims, their purpose is for their own happiness alone, but rather than just thinking about this life, they think about future lives. Among like this life and future lives, they have a striving for the happiness of future lives, like attaining a good migration as a human or a god. And so someone who has that kind of a thought, who is striving for such happiness in future lives, recognizing that to be important, they are then referred to as like a special being of the small scope. And someone who has such an attitude is considered to be a practitioner because of the fact that they aren't just thinking about this life alone, but rather what comes beyond that in future lives. They are a being of the small scope, this special kind of being of the small scope, and they have entered into the ranks of practitioners.
다 딘리기 기부 충무 개발자인데 세디기 대화가 코르에기 세디 대화가 참아 매나야 기와 치메기 코르에기 대화가 참아기요 딘리기 말인다 딘리 기부 충무기 강사 때 코로알레 타르가 되도니에 강사 말해 마이사 기부 딘 말해 생체 탐지기 되도 상기의 고방 더듬이에 가서 말해 이 마인사 기부 충분히 말해 대대에서 기부 충분히 말해.
So even though this kind of being doesn't have attachment to the pleasures of this life alone, they are still attached to samsaric pleasures. They aren't thinking about liberation from samsara. They aren't striving or seeking for that. And so therefore they aren't a being of middling scope. And so too, because they are again only thinking about their own aims and not thinking about a kind of liberation from samsara or being able to benefit others, they are not considered to be a being of great scope.
기후충 개발자들에게 깨와 치매기 하다미 대화 더듬이고요. 깨와 치마 하면 고마 돈도요. 깨와 치마 하면 고마 돈도요나 뒷통 더야기 유다게 탑랑 가르래라나 렌제나 이체네 네가 미디어 주방 개월 주에 될 대대 인자 렌제 기념인데 기후충 기념에 샤프레.
So here, this kind of special being of small scope, again, has a wish to obtain a good rebirth in the future as a human or a god, and therefore they have to think about, well, what are the kinds of causes and conditions that lead to such a life? And so this being of small scope then engages in the kind of practice or understanding of karma, cause and effect, recognizing that the 10 virtues are what one has to accomplish in order to secure a good rebirth in the future. So the kind of contemplation of karma, cause, and effect is included within the trainings for a being of small scope.
Geshe Dawa lente nyamne singende kandechi chilore lana jona lente chilsama lente ane sosor chele sama niyo lente chilsama tela ane le nyeba le pelchaba le macheba ta mecheba le cheba chumisema sene digi 상당 양념체들이
So here, in terms of the contemplation of karma, cause and effect, there's a sort of general contemplation, in addition to a sort of more individual or personal sort of reflection of karma, thinking about the individual kinds of karmas. And so in general, the kind of contemplation that one engages in is that karma is definite, karma increases, karma is such that you can't meet with results for the cause of which you did not commit, and those kinds of actions that you have committed are not going to be wasted.
어디지? 난 내내 소소체를 삼바세에서도 와 소소체에서도 소소소소로 와 아니 소소 가르쳐나 미기회 내당 계획에 소소체네 이와 체네 삼바한테 아니 수도 미기회 내대라 아니 주체네 류기권의 숨, 마기권의 시, 이기권의 숨, 가다 속적과 마지막에 되겠지. 상맹킹이라. 이게 미기를 내기다 하고 봐. 미기를 내기게 드리블 되나? 아니, 답을 드리고, 아니, 남민기 드리고, 규등기 드리고. 오, 디내기, 미기를 내기, 뭐, 가래. 디 드리고, 답을 규등, 남기죠 가르가르 기성체의 딱 이제체 아 계획에 되게 뭐 미기로 주방에 계획에 쭉아 계획에 되게 저부터라 아니 규정이 되고 남이 되고 답을 되고 레게 미기에 계획에 소소소소기 저분 영당도 상마마 태성체 하고와 전에 한 소소원에 미기에 타신 차원의 빵, 계획에 타신 차원의 죽, 인생이 미기회에다 계획에다 랑도는 양내 수시로 제가돼 렌제인 양내에서.
So here, in terms of the individual, this is thinking about virtuous actions and non-virtuous actions. And so here, in terms of this kind of contemplation, it is thinking about the individual kinds of, like, for example, the non-virtues, the 10 non-virtues, most all of you probably know, but the 3 of body, as in killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct, the 4 of speech, and the 3 of mind. And so recognizing those as non-virtuous actions, you then think about the kind of results that come from those. These can be variously translated in English, but we can call one the governing result, the ripening result, and the result that accords with the cause. So contemplating, thinking about each individual kind of action and what are the results that come from that. This applies to non-virtuous actions as well as to the 10 virtues that are the opposites of those, and reflecting upon, if I engage in this particular action, it can lead to these results. Again, results of different types, those that are sort of the governing result, the ripening result, and the result that accords with the cause. And based upon that, then, trying to abandon and not engage in even the most subtle kinds of non-virtuous actions, and striving as much as you are able to accomplish even the most subtle of virtuous positive actions. This is the practice of karma.
다음에 먼저 최응아바디 그리 이미 삼바세 인규만이 저는 니중고마 나오래 그리 이미 삼바라는 제무제랑이 공부 전에 뒤집 드려 말해 다 이나야 로좀 주의 님마들이 서기도 시가와 용당 도들이 위해서 나바텔라 그리 이미 고마 수마레스 다디시.
So the 5th then is contemplating the defect of samsara. Now sometimes this is called renunciation, but here teaching this in accordance with the way that is common to all of the various schools of Tibetan Buddhism. The 5th of these preliminaries is then contemplation of the defects of samsara.
Oh yeah. 그걸 님이 고봤어야지 로종기 냠네 간제스 차기 요래에서 내가더니나 다 그리님이 예사제기 까불라 로종양 뭐만데 타로되니 로종고 거래 니에게 타로 코로 빵네 타로 책이 예 타고도 책이 있으네 타고 되는 게 로디 약부체 양타바체 삼로 약부체 근데 삼로 약은 종으로 잡아 근데 타고 되는 로 맞게바디 깨바디 아니 봐 슈퍼도 당 어느 공부에 패치고 하래 이게 타고 되는 로 약이 직접 근데 타고 되는 로 약이 삼로나 타고 되는 로 약이 맞게바디 깨바 공부 정답 제거가 능력도 삼로나 누가 갈래라 코로나를 찾아지 코로나를 찾아지 삼로나 로 누가 근데 로 누가 되게 람다 셴 내가 터트로 빼줘요 준주대도 약올로 와이나 코로나 찾아 들을 누가 하가 매우서요 근데 코로나 찾아 삼로 누가 제 반대로 종수를 근데 삼로 누가 돼 매우서다 삼로 누가 돼 축총도 당거래 당구 축총도 당 되는 매우서 다 삼로 코로나 찾아게 삼로 누가 돼 축총도 당 되는 매우서야라 가르쳐버려야라 코로나의 님이 삼다 코로나님이 가서 망보 코로나를 깨여다데 가서 망보 삼았다나 어디에 코로나 찾아게 하는 매우서 버려서 이래서 다다 먼저 치료가 대라 우로좀 기념된다 제나 우로 정당 되지 세차만
So here, in terms of training the mind in this fifth preliminary of contemplating the defects of samsara, we can think about it in terms of training the mind in trying to strive for liberation, right? So there is a kind of good, a positive side of this by seeing the benefits of liberation and wanting to be able to attain that. That kind of attitude that is striving for liberation is what you are trying to generate, what you are trying to increase the strength of. This is the way in which you are training your mind to have this real sincere desire to obtain liberation from the cycle of samsara. So that's kind of the positive side of this, is that striving for liberation. And on the sort of negative side, our negative mind that we are trying to reduce and eventually eliminate is the kind of attachment, the clinging to samsara. And so, for example, by reading Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, and the descriptions that are given there, if we really think about those and the defects of samsara, we are able to get rid of those kinds of attitudes. I mean, first reduce our attachment to samsara and eventually be able to eliminate that. So what do we need to do in order to achieve that is really to think about, to contemplate deeply the faults of samsara, and we get rid of our kind of attachment to samsara. So there is, again, training in terms of the positive attitude of wanting liberation, and then training in terms of eliminating that negative side of our attachment to samsara.
Oh, 다양 로 정당 띵 sabtu tamne shirab thone ani be 로 정당 띵 sabtu taina 다가 나바들 먼저 정마바 그림의 메시지를 sabtu taina 그 몸을 줄 수원나 시래 코를 차에 차박이다 매버서 그래 이제 코를 차에 차박 네야 가는 것도 기분좋죠 안 차박이 가는 것도 야채거든 아니 당진으로 당진 말이 봐 근데 이 말이자 몸을 줄기 캐런이 안에 타고 되는 별로 깨세 타박에 레바뇽 세를 타박에스 레바뇽 세를 타스 그러 단 레바뇽이 가는 요구를 하나 아니 수미 이제 연락도 다 대딘진이 쪼가 되는 거래스 레바뇽 세를 타 레바뇽 세를 타 레바뇽 남도네 대다 주에레스 단 딘진이 레바뇽 용세게 싸워 당진이 쪼가 돼 간접스 매워 소버레라나 대다 쪼가니 동방 얘기 가버렸어 동료들이 싫었겠네 매워 소버레스 두수마 디 띵사고지기 아니 로 정당 송용데 또 중립이 따와가지 다음에 왜 따와가지네 아니 다들 그림님의 일로 정도 숨어있어.
So here, in terms of this fifth, contemplating the defect of samsara, this can be done in kind of a more profound way that is connected with our wisdom, right? And we can develop this, again, if we need to get rid of our attachment to samsara, if we investigate, well, what is the root cause of all of our attachment to samsara? As it is explained by Nagarjuna and other masters, it really comes to our ego grasping, right? Our grasping at a self. And so in order to eliminate completely the kind of attachment that we have to samsara, we need to eliminate that. And so he has a verse which essentially says that liberation is the kind of exhaustion or extinction of karma and the afflictions. And it is, samsara comes about through our karma and afflictions, and particularly the kind of grasping at a self and the sort of proliferations, the elaborations that come from that. And it is the realization of emptiness that eliminates those sorts of elaborations. So we have this kind of grasping at a self, this improper thinking that causes connected with our various other afflictions, and by turn we create karmas due to that. And it is really the root of all of that is our grasping at a self that it then gives rise to these various conceptual elaborations. And it is through the realization of emptiness, the wisdom realizing emptiness, that we are able to eliminate those kinds of elaborations. And the extinction, the exhaustion of karma and our afflictions is then liberation.
Oh yeah. 다 너희가 있는 나다 문제치 나봐 그리 님이 삼았어야 돼. 또또리 때마산이 주는데 대바 시수년이 양면치레스. 나 대바 시기 나네. 동네 대바다 군중 대바라 태성 공부하고 지체네. 아니 제가 얘나 다다 생기나 코와가 차게 차과를 로 매버스 길로 좀해야라 팬도 친구시기 바래. 다 되네 고den다 람댕이들라 태성도가 야고 제가 얘나 타고 되니 로 아니 좀 쓰듯 타고 되니 로 마이크에 공부 당하러와 될라 팽들어래. 너들은 코로나에 동네 대바도 꾸준 대바 니 사배원에 코리님이 로죠. 코리님이 삼다. 다 고den다 람댕이 태성도가 전에 타고 되니 로게 딜나네가 람댕이 님고 람라우스 냠네잖아. 안 타고 되거래스.
So here, to really sort of essentialize this fifth of the preliminary practices to contemplating the defects of samsara, we can do this through the practice of the study of the Four Noble Truths. And if we study these well, this is very beneficial in terms of our being able to eliminate our attachments to samsara and generate this kind of positive attitude of striving for liberation. So by contemplating the truth of suffering and the truth of the origin of suffering, we come to really see fully the faults of samsara, the defects of samsara, and that is extremely beneficial in eliminating the kind of attachment that we have to samsara. And on the other hand, when we contemplate the truth of cessation and the truth of the path, this is very beneficial for us being able to generate this kind of striving for liberation, seeing that it is possible to attain a cessation of our suffering based upon engaging in the various practices of the path. The path really being essentially those three trainings that we've talked about earlier.
Oh yeah. That indeed, 기부 숨기 나네 기부 딩기 가사다 기부 딩기 최 양내 우로 정당 세야 돼 가르래 하나 받아들여서 코리님이 대바시 때려야 중이 번에 코리님이 성체 딱 얘는 코로님이 통사들 덴제 코로대 빵배 타바토가 지리 선을 로지게 타바데 토베체도 아니 예 람데 람라우스 냠멘지니 스로게 이나야 심지 신기체 신생제 탐제 타고토의 제도 상계 고모토의 제도세 선도 마다나체 랑이 타바 랑이 코로나의 탑에 타고토의 제도 선도 땅에 라부수 양내 제나 덴데 양내 제에 선도 동기 강사때 기부팅레스 아디 풍디 조조 바데 안디샤기 시베 델라 약초시 디베레 도다니 강시 랑시 zam되니 기부되니 정신 자소시 어떻게
Therefore, among the three types of being, the being of middling scope then engages in these trainings, the training of thinking about the defects of samsara, contemplating the Four Noble Truths, the 12 links of dependent origination, to come to understand the process by which one engages in samsara and also the way in which one is able to be liberated from that. And due to those kinds of contemplations, they give rise to this thought of, I am going to obtain liberation. In order to be able to obtain liberation, I am going to engage in the practice of the path, particularly the practice of the three trainings. But they are doing this with a kind of attitude of liberation for themselves alone, for their own freedom from suffering, not thinking about the needs or welfare of other sentient beings. So this is what characterizes a being of the middling scope. Again, as is explained in The Lamp for the Path by Joel Atisha, he describes this kind of being of the middling scope as being one who has turned their back on the pleasures of samsara, that has given up sort of karma and the afflictions in order to attain liberation for themselves alone. That is referred to as a being of the middling scope.
당분문도 달라라 세네 기우치를 남기 문으로 대라다 또도스의 세계다 그래서 신이 진수 당거리 얘네 대조로 쳐 얘네 지원에다 봐스 얘네 레데스야 돼 아니 기우 숨기 다음에 기우 춤을 춰 기우 춤을로 정말쳐 다음에 코리님이 나도 기부 드림기로 정당 너들나 기부 드림기 최 연계되게 돼 먼저 달라 쉐베 먼저 주게 달라 샤바레스 다 먼저 주시 사람.
So here, then again, where it says train in the preliminaries, which are then the basis for the practice, the actual practice of Mahayana mind training, we have again these five trainings of relying upon a virtuous spiritual friend, contemplating the leisure and endowment that we have, contemplating death and impermanence, karma, cause and effect, and thinking about the defects of samsara. And so the kind of contemplation of karma, cause and effect is really the training, the level of the being of small scope, training one's mind in that, and then contemplating the defects of samsara constitutes the training for the being of middling scope. And so up until here, it is really the kind of preliminary practices that characterize those sorts of practices of the being of small and middling scope that are then the basis upon which one engages in the actual practice of the Mahayana.
다 차別시쇼라 아니바 제 무시라서 다원만나 뭐서 뭐 거셔시 니바 무시 장주기 셈니라서 장주 셈니 고주 장주 소전에서 나다 와는 거래 셈니 종와라 니레스 당고 고주 장주 셈 종와니 사티고 줘 무시를 내버렸다 So then next we come to the second topic, which is training in the awakening mind, the main practice. And so here, this then is divided, the actual sort of training the mind in bodhicitta, which is the actual sort of body of this text, is divided into two topics. 군수 장주부 셈 종화세리 군수 덴베왕도 땅내 군수 덴베기 람양 스들이 가다 탑 장주 셈 아니 로종에 대체 다 장주 셈 로종에 꼴라 로종이 자식 장체나 레레 감지 따지죠 탑 장주 셈 로종아 대라양 튕기 값라 로종단단 아니 튕섬기 값라 아니 로종단 니다 튕기 값라 레레 감지 찍라다 그나 감지 쳐고 동네니고 발만장 레베 버림 라면상 대니봉과 껴박차 유르숨 도숨 게다 숨세 대버체 다 튼섬기 냠내데 제기메나 도르와 대답 잡고 그러체 조만군도 생기장 대체 대바도 생긴다 다 생기냐.
So here, then the first of these is training the mind in conventional bodhicitta, the method of conventional bodhicitta. And this can be further divided into when one is practicing in an actual kind of meditative session and those times between meditative sessions. So here, and again, this English, all of these lines are in here, but they're not necessarily in this order. It begins with banish all blames to a single source, meditate on the great kindness of all, train in the two, giving and taking alternately, commence taking progressively from your own side, place these two astride your breath, 3 objects, 3 poisons, and 3 roots of virtue. And so those, up until there, that is talking about during the actual kind of meditative session. And then the 3 lines that come after that, gather together the abridged quintessence of this advice. Remember this by repeated recollection and practice every activity by these words. This is the kind of interval between sessions.
다 생절이다 생절. 레레 세들이 빼나 말아줘라. 민수 누가 더 종소나. 근데 민수들이 중요한 게 견사 술투 수체 라니. 见都是的话，见杂什么见杂，并且民族用呀以见杂水钱来说的话，见杂，我的来什么见杂，比如说了呀，这个哪个的，他说的驴了呀，那是修当，这驴了那是修当的，你用呀以见的水钱的人，可能说不定哪个就做定钱的是吧？是吧？我的的。 동네가 속에 교회에서 용사기 견자 용사기 용견 중공 중사 어디 레레 탐제세 레레 탐제가 다르디 레레세야디 독사를 시작으로 감순 코르웨기 동날당 아니 저게 내 나사 좀 마시바 교 탐제 교연되죠 제부차 이게 감성 거래기 동에 내 나서 탐마시 교연되죠 용사 용야 이게 레레 탐제 레레 탐제 찌라다 소리 바우다다고 빼는 시간만 가우다다요 가우다다라나 찌라다스라나 찌라 요리라고 가우다다, 얘네 바우다다, 바우다다 소리, 찔러다 소리, 찔러 요래라고 말, 찔러 토그 요래라, 토사, 찔러 토그 요래스, 다리 제봤어. 얘가 공대 용진 시장생기, 우로종 든든매기, 우로종기 제바, 그 최슈지었다, 우로종기는 게슈리 그래. 어디 나라, 레레 감지 찔러다서 가다 많이 바다에 있어, 바다. 바우다다 그래서 비유들 레레 감지 찔러다 소리 디디 동네다 좀 마시고 용해야 기견사 상마 투사 찔러도 셔터 찔러다 단지를 가려야나 랑진지 로와 야 기치셔들 로종가 나와 랑진지가 당지기 민다요래 디 준주 나와야 랑진지가 당지기 민다요 이게 로조랑 기토니 계시잖아 레레던 찍었다 소리 당진 찍었다 이 당진이 나와 니유스 다방을 조르는 제바체 다 제부스의 진진지 이유스 어디.
So here, then getting into the commentary on the words themselves. This again might come in a different part of the text for some, but here it begins the conventional training in the conventional awakening mind with this line: "Banish all blames to a single source." So here, when we use this kind of word "blame," it's like, well, who did that? Who is responsible for that? What is the condition that led to this coming about? So, like, for example, if our body is experiencing some kind of pain or something, it's like, well, what is the source of that? What is the origin of that? What is to blame for that? Well, it's a particular illness, right? Here, this is really getting at, like, the condition that led to that, the root condition that brought that about. And so here, as it's, in this case, we are talking about the kind of sufferings of samsara within these three realms, all of the various faults and sufferings that occur within samsara, all of the illnesses, all of the pain, all that is inauspicious and so forth. Where is that coming from? Or what is the sort of thing to blame for that? And now here in the Tibetan, there are two different spellings of the word that has been translated as banish in this one, in this particular version of the English. And this is really the idea that it is getting at, like, where is that coming from? What is the root condition that leads to all of these kinds of sufferings of samsara? What is the most sort of thing that we can put the blame on? And here where it says banish all blames to a single source, that single source is our self-cherishing attitude. Now here, our self-cherishing attitude can be a name that is given to both this grasping at an ego, grasping at like a truly existent self or self that exists in and of itself, as well as the kind of self-cherishing attitude that arises from that. So holding to there being some kind of autonomous self, as well as the kind of self-centeredness that comes from that, really is the source of all of our pain and suffering within samsara. So this is the meaning of banish all blames to a single source.
마라조르야 세디디기 겨치멘디기 타베디기 탐지게마 상이디기 디기시 토비요. 데데기 바인자 아니 심지어 그러나 같은 처럼 보면서.
And then next in this version is meditate on the great kindness of all. And so here, all referring to all other sentient beings equal to the extent of space. And they are really the source of all of the good and happiness that we experience in the world. Whether it is the happiness of this life, happiness and goodness in future lives, that of liberation, and even the state of Buddhahood. This is due to the kindness of others.
동네니보스 땅하면서 동네냐면 제여봐 장배비 버스도 되네 동화가 민지미 버스도 되네 레바 강다 랑이 되와 규도자가 생전을 파동 신기 안에 동네 규도자가 랑이네 된지게 동네냐면 제죠 된지게 동네냐면 제야데 아니 당고 동네 공유도 잡아 아니 거리는 제일 너무스 냠도 냅지는 너무스 당고 동안 대내양 대박 양 대박 전에 거리는 제일 공부가 인상 뺄만 장스 뺄만 쉐버들이 냠도 많이 맞제 뺄만 장스 동네니고 뺄만 장
So then we next turn to the actual kind of training in giving and taking. So here it says then train in the two, giving and taking alternately. So here when we think about training in compassion, compassion. This has to do with taking the suffering of others and training in love, giving to them one's happiness and so forth. And so here, this is something that should be done when we are training. We train in stages, right? We build up to something, and we also train in such a way with these two that we are alternating between them. We do when we are taking on the suffering of others, we're not doing that at the same time as we are giving, but rather we are doing so in a way where we alternate between those two.
Lobsang simjin shingi tingdo, shingi dunga rangi leya de, kale kaku chigu dudas, kelte da, takwa tasuni. Kelte kerangi, lobsang simjin shingi dunga gyuda jeba, nen naza, tamashiba tama lobsang, susu lembe gong jaya la, kanyi chigu duna, tangu keramu susu gi, dunga dinzo leya, ani lo jams. Pena chashana, ngala ya, ani takatana, sugu devudu, sem devudu, ini memang mau pada ngarora, ani gere dunge, nare dunge, damai Inggris. Sekarang ini mau berdunge dege, nggak tata melini sen, rangine, lembe korim sen, rangne zam sudah, rangi mau berdunge, tata rangine. Tidak jenis bongci ya, ni ya, os cungsona, ani sini. Simjin shingi dungende rangi layati nyamne ches. Ladi dirita. Ganyi chena simjin shingi dunge rangi layati tangu nime kome ganyi chena tangu susu yi maungbe dunge tada layati koms. Hari yaku chasona simjin shingi dungende rangi layati koms sore. Lende kori rangi tsamus. Tsamu shiawato gotsuk shiawato.
So then next it says, commence taking progressively from your own side. So this practice of taking means taking on the suffering as well as its causes of other sentient beings. And so here, this is something that most of us are not able to do immediately, right? You have to train or develop the kind of capacity to engage in this kind of practice. And so, as it says here, we should first commence taking from your own side, or with yourself, we could say. So we first, as we are training our minds, should take on our own suffering. Like right now, maybe I'm healthy, I'm happy, I'm not experiencing any kind of difficulties, but there will be those sorts of sufferings that come in the future. The suffering of sickness and illness, the suffering of aging, and so forth. And so imagining taking on one's own future suffering, we begin by gaining some kind of proficiency at that level, right? Where we're able to imagine taking on our own suffering. And then once we have gained some kind of stability or proficiency in that, we can then expand out to taking on the sufferings of others. So here the instruction is that if it's difficult for you to immediately begin by taking on the sufferings together with their causes of other sentient beings, you should begin training by doing this with respect to your own suffering first.
Oh yeah, that is the issue there. Tini lunga kya cha, tini sude, tongwe nyamne, leme nyamne, tongwe nyamutes. Lunga kya cha, chidane tongwe gomala, ujumu ki lungi nyamne chok mare. Sengi toane, shengi tongwe sama rangi le, rangi dewa sama shena je, dedis che yo. Ta yina ya, ujumu da jane. Ane lunga jane nyamne chigi ida, ane shengi dunga susu lebe tabla, ngo shengi dunga yeba nama, ane chigi ue kapu dinde, tuwa kapu dinde che, ane susu ki lung u, ya uba da nyamdo, ane dunga sama rangi lebe leba che. Taya ngo rangi dewa da dewe gyuk yeba la nama ue kapu dinde che, yang lung u, chulo tang yung de, 양치를 땅에 심재pel라 톱순 사마체네 룸단자네 냥년체나야 드리세데 기념룸을 껴차.
So then next it says, place these two astride your breath. So here, when it comes to the practice of taking and giving, we don't necessarily have to connect this with our breathing. Again, it is a mental exercise where we are thinking that we are taking on the suffering together with its causes of other sentient beings and giving our happiness to them. However, it could be useful to place this astride the breath, or to do this in conjunction with one's breath. So as you breathe in, you can imagine taking on others' suffering and the causes of their suffering. What is in the nature of that is in the aspect of like black light or black smoke that we are drawing into ourselves. And we imagine that we are alleviating that we are taking away their suffering together with its causes. And then when we exhale, we imagine our own happiness, what is in nature, in essence, our own happiness in the form of like a white light that is going out and sort of striking other sentient beings, and we imagine that they are given that happiness. So this is what it means when it says here to place these two astride your breath.
이도옹 가야마인데 바르마 숨 유숨 라야지 이도와 이도묘와 바르마 숨 유숨 두숨 라야지 오브젝트 숨 여자 유숨을 밑에 아니 녀몽 두숨 요 대차 시단 두숨 이 간에라는 유도옹아라 미용데 대차게 유도 묘하는 배경데 시단계 유도 묘 가야마인데 발만 묘인데 뜨묻기야. 근데 인상 유숨을 때문에 독숨계 유숨 독숨체. 다 근데 독숨계야 돼. 먼저 로종 양념체들 디 매버서 와. 다들 매버서야 가지고 그 갑대지고 와. 한 갑대지 저게 계속숨 계속숨 가래 여ሻ매의 계사 시간매의 계사 뜨문매의 계사 세네 계속숨 대인상 되차매의 계사 시에 매바디 유매의 매바 썸마이와 되차의 년보 되차의 합계의 인이 계사라 되차매의 계사 시간의 년보의 합계의 인이 계사라 시간매의 계사 뜨문의 합계 인계 인부 인계 계산라 뜨문의 계산 손. 근데 이마 인자 똑똑할 수가 없네. 유도와 달마스는 믿네. 내가 제가 뜨문이 숨 깨가 이나스. 람상 깨가 하고에 토네. 내가 깨마다 내가 인연보 갑대 내전의 계산 보면서 시당 깨와다 시당 인연보 시당의 계산 보면서 뜨문 깨와다 뜨문 인연보 뜨문의 계산 보면서 됐어. 그래서 되자기 인연보 세 되자기 인연보 때 거의 인연 상관도 소파 아니 되주제들이 시당 인연보 보면서 대 시당 인연보라 자만의 인연을 써보면 소파 돼. 뜨문 인연보 보면서 뜨문 인연보라 지리 시당이 나와가 하고도야. 다음에 동반이 인중이 따와 또 시작될 수 와야.
So up until now, this has been training in the conventional mind in terms of the practice of giving and taking, and the next line turns to a kind of different practice, which is, as it says here, there are the three objects, the three poisons, and the three roots of virtue. So here, the three three objects is referring to those objects that we find to be pleasant or attractive, those that we find to be unattractive, and those that are neither, that are neutral objects to us. And in observing those three objects, we give rise to the three poisons. Toward those things that we find attractive or pleasant, we have a kind of desire, attachment, and those that we find to be unpleasant, we feel hatred or aversion, and those that are neither sort of particularly attractive or unattractive, we have still an ignorance towards that. And so here, when it then says the three roots of virtue, this is referring to the kind of antidotes to those particular poisons, that which is able to confront, to overcome that particular poisonous attitude. So the three roots of virtue are referring then to non-attachment, to non-hatred, and to non-ignorance. But it's not just in the sense of a lack of attachment or a lack of hatred, but again, that which is actively able to confront that particular poison that we are experiencing. And so when these various poisons arise in relation to those various objects, we should apply the proper root virtue as an antidote to that. But the kinds of antidotes to attachment are things like thinking about the defects of samsara. The kinds of antidotes to our hatred or contemplating love and compassion and so forth. And in general, the antidotes to ignorance are in general wisdom, but in particular the kind of wisdom realizing selflessness, the wisdom contemplating dependent origination and so forth.
다 되네. 제기 매마 돌드와 하시는데 다가 유순 두순 계속순기 양면데 가르에스라나 아니 제기에서 제대 아니 무시 정주 셈이 로종과 다들 튕기가라 정주 셈이 로종 근데 튕기가라 정주 셈이 군수 정주 셈이 로데 장네 디제 그들 등성으로와 다 등성이 까불라 아니 냠렌치야 돌드시나 매마 수제네 돌드시나 유르수 도순께서 숨기레스네 디수 유르수 도순께서 숨테네 아니 제기 등성기 매마 돌드가 대라 제목불에 체르시네 대라데 아니 정주를 쓰는 대라 제목불을 체 제소 방야 이 체도스 대라 제목불을 체 저런군도 다 저런군도 저런 대라 시요 두이 저런 아니 두배 저런 아니 냥이 저런 착배 저런 도착냥두 라나도 도의 저런 착스 참정도 차도처럼 도착 냐는 냐대처럼 독수리 싸대처럼 도착 냐도 대중이 처럼 운두 상마바스 처럼 시간바스 처럼 운두 세계장 수를 당기 튕기 내가 받아 정주국선 원에 넘어와 별제를 넘겨와 다 전성이 내가 봐 대중이 정주국선 제대체도 장주 쌤 제대체는 생들도 카네마 여기 계속 땅라 생기장스 빼나 장주 선조를 그렇게 마제반은 이거지 개발하면 어느 것도 배우시고 세야도 야 장주 쌤 보면 그런 생들이 약국들이 결에 열에 다다 되기 시작하는 그래 어디도 되게 막 거리야 어디를 결에 타는 임에 장주 쌤 제대체도 생 예제 아니 장주 쌤이 생들이 결에 계속 땅 세들이 저런 세기장
So here, this next line then says, following that, the sort of abridged, the condensation of those instructions. So here, the word like following that is referring to, like in the meditation session, one is training in bodhicitta by engaging in the practice of taking and giving and so forth. But one should, following that, sort of repeatedly recall the essential, essentialized instructions, and remember this by repeated recollection. And here, I think I read it in a way that's not necessarily right. So it says in all actions trained by means of the words, but here it's really referring to these 4 different types of activities, as we usually call it. So here, when it comes to the 4 sort of types of actions, we have when one is going somewhere, when one is sort of strolling or wandering somewhere, when one is laying down, or when one is seated in one single place. So in all of the various activities that you might be engaged in, you should, as you have been training the mind during the actual session, remember the meaning of that by recollecting the words, right? So we can do this in the sense of like calling to mind various words, various verses. For example, may the precious mind of bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, arise, where it has arisen without any decline, only increase more and more. So in order to sort of reinforce the training that we are doing during the session, one should repeatedly recall the words upon which those sort of contemplations are based in order to keep that in mind.
사제 당로 군수 전주부서는 로정와 시행되기 생대 상마 차수 다 되게 되셔도 좋아이나 지금 제가 맨날인 제르방라 전주부서나 동리도 시험이 계시게와 주차 고면 접차래 나이는 나도 배전하는 된자 아니 되게 되셔 또또 주시고인다 군수 전주부서는 로정와 시행되 당분간은 로정와 시를 로디 양심을 군수 전주부 생으로 정하셔도 군수 전주부 생때 로정야 로디 딘제기 로디 정무서도 디 특별 차기 약했다 대단 무튼별 차기 맵소라 이래마 인자 군수 전주부 생으로 로정야 대라 다시 냥주로 로정을 원도 땅다 배전나가 다시 냥바도 송는도 냥내 원리 지게나 다시 냥바도 되게 사제마의 가래라나 당고 다시 냥바 니바 다진진이 깨서마 수바 신진진이 연애서마 시바 다시 제와 마바 동네 공대 생게 바스 마 이거레스 이 되게 되시
So here, that's kind of a commentary on the meaning of the words, but to give a commentary more on the meaning. And in the past, I've given extensive commentary on these 2 awakening minds. So here we have gone through the first section of the first topic, the actual topic of the text, which is training in the mind of awakening. And here, particularly the kind of conventional awakening mind. And previously, I've given teachings on the sort of conventional awakening mind as well as emptiness. And here, looking at this text in particular and connecting it with that, we need to, in order to be able to train our minds. Now here it talks particularly about the practice of giving and taking, but training our minds goes beyond just what are the words here, but we need to understand what are the kinds of minds or attitudes that are conducive to or in harmony with developing this attitude of the mind of awakening. What are those sorts of things that are detrimental to it? And try to increase and develop those kinds of conducive conditions, those things that will help to develop our attitude of our mind of awakening further, and try to eliminate those things which are not conducive to it. So here, if one is actually practicing, you don't just do the kind of practice of giving and taking, but rather it is on the basis of something like training the mind and equalizing and exchanging self and others. And so if we look at that kind of practice, it comes in 5 topics, which is then first equalizing self and other, and then contemplating the fault of our self-cherishing attitude, trying to, and then contemplating the benefits of an attitude that cherishes others, and then there's the actual sort of exchanging of those attitudes, followed by the practice of giving and taking.
장주선의 고마를 잤어. 다가 현동냐면 담부인데 매도 동안냐면 탐정당시 송환자 시소 송환하신 제네 딱 신양배기 로종당 원인을 가르래 라나 아니 심제 탐제를 명내와 심제 탐제 랑당다와 대화도 동면면대와 냐마 임베스 다이 심제 탐제와 니린 차방 매번 팬들주의 섬줄 rindumewa chau samati.
So here, in terms of the first of these, training the mind and equalizing self and others, there is a verse from Shantideva that the translator will not get quite exactly right, but it basically is referring to, may I train myself to see all others as equal to me, equal in terms of wanting to have happiness and not wanting to suffer, developing a mind that wishes to benefit them all without a sense of closeness to some and distance from others. May I be able to generate this kind of bodhicitta, or this sort of attitude toward others.
다니바 라한진이 이게 사바세야디 준주나라 지대 동네 진예바 대교 다들 좀 마음이 쉬다 지식을 제바시 된세 아까 제바랑기 된제가 세야디 셰야 이거랑은 제대로 겨워타면 되겠죠. 냐와 집에다가 교육도 많이 마시고 선소하신 제네 니바랑 진진이 교회에 로즈를 잡아와야 도와 레레 던지지가 다 세대다 준주체나 당기체 로종체나 레레 던지지가 다 어디게 커도라 레레 던지지가 다 시비 찍대 랑 진진으로 와 제가 딱 진진 세야데 직대의 눈에 탐제 이 중공 직대의 눈에 탐제 용사기 깬자 뭐다 랑 진진들이 제샤 제네 어디 서부터야 돼 랑 뒤에 서부터야 돼 랑 진진이 님이 삼아서야 돼.
So then next is thinking about the faults of our self-cherishing attitude. And again, there is a verse from Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, where he explains that in brief, all of the suffering, all of the kind of badness and inauspicious things within the world come from this self-cherishing attitude. What need is there to say much about this? And so seeing that it is our self-cherishing attitude that is the source of all of our troubles and difficulties, and recognizing on the other hand that this attitude that cherishes others is really the source of all benefit and goodness. Here we shouldn't act childishly, but rather we should, by seeing the kind of fault of our self-cherishing attitude, as came above in that line where it said, banish all blames to a single source. This is referring to our self-cherishing attitude as being the root cause, the thing that is to blame for all of the kind of suffering and difficulty that we experience. The real root thing that leads to that is our self-cherishing attitude.
다음에 숨바 시행진의 연내 삼바세야티 준주 시사체나 직대대와 진행과 대규 현대들 중 망도시의 지식을 도와주는 된제가 시소 송하대체 다디 임바기도 로종 직체나 끌어가는 쪽으로 공세되다 끌어가는 쪽으로 공시가 되기 시행진의 연내 숨요래 대대 임바 인상 배 랑다 신 지대나를 예배 디기 참마 강화 때문에 종례에서도 신승제가 때문에 종아래스 대인자 신승제기 꺼져서 못하는 신을 깨버리는 거래스 신을 깨버리는 거지 종나 아니 신진들라 때문에 아니 등이 터치 맞지 그래서 신진들 여대 성도해야 돼 대. 딱 되려야 준주나가 토바심이 된자가 세다 하려버려 나중에 때문에 처음에 대수미 상계 탐제 시행진세가 때문에 당부 장주주도 도이게 바로 계산 장문수 소사 다른 것도 상계에 지스나가 마세게 봐도 semjingi tuyo rupati chungwarwa. Chata shenjingi sayate la tetakariyate du se samdaya teres.
So then there is the kind of a benefit of cherishing others. And so here in the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, Shantideva has said that whatever goodness, whatever happiness there is within the world, all of this comes from an attitude which cherishes others. In brief, like what need is there to say more? This is the sort of source of the Shakyamuni. Like this is the basis upon which all Buddhas and Buddhas of the three times have been able to attain that state. And so whatever kind of happiness of myself and others, this really has its source in an attitude of cherishing others. The root text of this 7-point mind training, this comes in the line that says here, recall or meditate on the great kindness of all, recognizing that it is other sentient beings, particularly this attitude of cherishing others, that leads to the source of all. It is the source of all of our happiness. And so here we should recognize that all Buddhas of the three times, they all began by giving rise to this attitude of bodhicitta, and then over 3 countless eons accumulated merit, and finally attained that state of perfect, complete enlightenment, remaining for as long as space exists, for as long as there are sentient beings, in order to lead them out of their suffering. And so it is really this attitude of cherishing others that is the source of all goodness and happiness, and thereby we should contemplate on the benefits of that.
다들 시와 다신 제와세 다 다신 제와세텔라 지찬에 준주나와 아니 르다롱주 대신 거다 르다 기회롱주도 뜻은 개와지사와 생주꾼이 되는 좀 방법을 방법을 잘 소개하기 이 말에 제로 지금이 라인 지금 시샤제야이나 장기 키면지 처음의 경우 르롱주 뜻은 계속되죠 탐제 생제 코네도 땅와 차 상한테 다신제와 세대체 다 다신제의 냠내는 나는 님을 교화돼 동네 보면 돼 어디 다들 저기 동네 님고 별말죠 레벨 보주 당내서 뒤니는 배우가 자 세배 책대 다신제의 냠내는 님부터 되겠어 자와디체.
So here then the next is the actual kind of exchange of self and others in terms of exchanging our self-cherishing attitude for an attitude that cherishes others. And so there are verses again from Shantideva wherein he talks about the kind of attitude of all of my happiness, all of the good things that I have, may I give those to others, and in turn wishing to be able to take on the suffering and misery of all of their sentient beings. And so really the essential kind of practice, and this is also in Rinpoche's, I believe his Songs of Experience, he has a similar kind of line dealing with this idea of the attitude of exchanging our self-cherishing for the attitude that cherishes others. And this is really this sort of heart or essential practice of that really is this practice of taking and giving, training in giving and taking alternately.
다 dak신 제외 냠네 지다 동네니 냠네 축축부 제용데 장마청보다 닌지청보대 하장 유축청 되기위해서 장마청보다 닌지청보 축축부 폐용데 아니 셈게 그거래 다 셈게 마바 셈게 되나 아니 뭐도 뒤에 가서 어디 주된 장마보는 뭐도 뒤에 셈게 빠진 신전체 양가부서는 장주도 송하나신 두바이다 되게 셈게 다 두바이 세아데 신전도마 랑도도마 디니 상회 셈게 다디 라웨토는 셔나 냠네다 되는 셔나 만나가다 셈제 탐제 대화타다 대화다 동네 타다의 제대 상이 유사와 그바를 자수를 신전도마 디체도 나기 상이 바바가 토바를 자우스를 랑도도마 굉장히 자우스한테 셈 캐버리 텐데 두바이에다 되는 셈 어디지라 장주 셈스.
So here then through this practice of giving and taking, by engaging in this kind of practice of giving and taking, we are able to enhance, to increase our love, our compassion, to to an extraordinary degree, right? This increases, enhances those kinds of attitudes of wanting others to have happiness and wanting them to be free from their suffering. And this really culminates then in the attitude of the mind of awakening, of bodhicitta itself, which is when we give rise to this, it is an attitude that is endowed with these two kinds of aspirations. This aspiration, again, on the basis of really observing sentient beings and wanting to free them from their suffering and wanting to give them happiness, one gives rise to this aspiration, I will place them in the state of Buddhahood, a state that is the highest kind of happiness, free from any kind of suffering. And in order to be able to do that, I myself will become a Buddha. So this special attitude of bodhicitta, again, is endowed with these two aspirations of wishing for the benefit of all sentient beings, and in order to be able to actualize that, striving for the state of Buddhahood oneself.
Oh yeah. That turn some yi na ne turn yi ka la chang ju sem gong la ya de mo ne gong da de ke yes. That turn some yi ka la chang ju sem la je so tang nyong ka de ke ma ya chang ju sem lo so ba gong ne ka de ja to che ko ba yes. That chang ju sem gong ne turn some yi de la ka de na so so do wa kun lo ma de ya de yi so ne de na la do wa don la chang ju sem de cha 차마 장주 semdencha, nyama 장주 semdencha, duna 장주 semdencha 세 어디에 있는 거죠?
수수거래스.
콜라 텐션.
So here then, in terms of training the mind in the conventional bodhicitta, or conventional mind of awakening, there is the kind of training that we do within the session itself by engaging in the practice of giving and taking, training that mind of bodhicitta, developing that attitude. And then there is the times between sessions, right, where we recollect that, we recollect the meaning of that, as well as identify any time that we have given rise to some kind of affliction and try to overcome that, try to eliminate whatever affliction might be. And so as the great Bodhisattva, the master of Kunalama Rinpoche, has stated, when I am going, may I train in bodhicitta. When I am sitting, may I train in bodhicitta. When I am laying down, may I train in bodhicitta. In all sort of situations, may I train my mind in bodhicitta. And that is really the kind of advice that, or the sort of ethos that we should follow during the times between sessions. So, okay, we have reached time, so we will stop there for today. So, because we are going to be turning then to the ultimate awakening mind, which has to do with the wisdom of realizing emptiness, which can be quite difficult, I would encourage all of you to go home and get some rest, and then tomorrow morning wake up early and make good supplications to Manjushri, that you might be able to really be successful in approaching this topic of selflessness or emptiness as we will go through it tomorrow.
Sami Kenyan Lanker Lady, we are Rama to Jizo Nanda, Hamada, Buddha, the Zupurulaya, Sim, the Kanyan, which is Chayadua. And it did not shake Marazo Dakasule, Jiggy, Doubling Gio, and Wushu, Kanyan Chayadua. And Kashaya, Game Drum Entertainment, Sim, Kanyan Chayadua. I don't know to Zolaya, Geshe, Samula Kanyachea, Kedi Tata Martina, Moma, Kanyachea, Tada, Jay Yamache, the Kandas Dingam Domain Chavre, Digi, Tablon, Yamichadam, Sunny Lacores, the Sunny important Shibuji Church, yours, I cannot do Petrola.
So, also one more important thing to mention. Tomorrow we will be getting to the third of these points, which is taking adverse conditions onto the path. And this is an extremely important kind of training, right? We look around the world and we can see our parents, our friends, we ourselves experience all kinds of negative circumstances. We encounter various types of difficulties, and learning how to, all people of all ages, whether you are young or whether it is people that are older or younger, we all have times in which we encounter those kinds of adverse circumstances. And so having the kind of tools, the methods to be able to deal with those sorts of situations is a very important point of mind training. And so as we will be covering this very important point, I would encourage all of you who are able to come tomorrow to come tomorrow.